Well, brothers and sisters, good to see you. This is the other Paul, and we are finally here for one of my most anticipated presentations on this channel ever. And we have a gigaton of people watching, comparatively speaking, compared to other things, but a lot of people watching. Like an hour before this was going to start, there were already like 15 people waiting, which was pretty flipping awesome. And the man himself, James White, shared the stream announcement on Twitter right after I posted it, which is like epic, super epic. I cannot. It's going to be epic, going to be exciting. I'm really praying. This is genuinely the first time in a very long time that I've been nervous for a stream, like even for like pretty significant ones, because it's literally just natural for me. I can just make a stream in 2 minutes, know for a fact I'll be broadcasting to tons of people, and hundreds, if not thousands of people will be watching it later. And it's like nothing to me. It's just like, yeah, hey, it's like going to the pub. This is something else. This is big stuff. This is genuinely big stuff. And I'm nervous because I hold myself up to pretty high standards, scholarship wise and all that. So I really really do hope that, how do I say it? That this is as definitive as I want to be. I'm genuinely hoping that I wasn't just being clickbaity. Because for one, this is going to be going over data that has been gone over many times. But the main thing that I want to make groundbreaking of it is just with establishing clear categories, criteria, wiping away confusions that are ubiquitous across these discussions, and then most importantly, pooling all the data together to take a look at the larger mosaic that they give. That's easily the most important thing in this discussion that people very rarely do, and that's why people keep talking past each other, going in circles. It sucks. It's not the best, and God willing, I'll be able to get over that, because I put a big emphasis on that. Obviously, I'm going through the evidence one by one in very good detail, but then at the end, everything's going to be pulled up. So that's what I'm, God willing, going to be. Lots of people in the chat right now. People, make yourself known. I'm going to give some greetings, whatever, and then after I go through some initial comments and greetings, I'm going to largely leave the chat because I want to be terse, because there's a lot of stuff to go through. So I don't want this to go for insanely long. And to start off with, thank you so much again, Josh. As usual, Boba Fett looks good behind you. Indeed, he does. He just got back from a good old campaign against the Saracens, so he's looking mighty sharp there. I actually want to make him a side character on videos or streams one day, where I give him like some like harsh French accent, and he dogs me out all the time for being a Protestant. But thank you again, Josh, as usual, for the super chats. Oh, dweeb. I'm gonna have to watch it back later probably. Bro, I'm so excited, man. Me too, man. I'm more nervous than excited. Bonaventure, good to see you, buddy. What's up, Paul? Obviously, I'll disagree with you here, but good luck. Thank you very much, buddy. I'm very happy to see you here. I hope everyone can learn from this. What else we got? Speaking in all accent, your mum. Boom, roasted. Is this us? Is this the debunking stream? Well, half debunking. So the thing I want to do is to have, obviously I make comments on it here and there, but I just want to focus on a positive assessment first. Positive assessment of the evidence before getting into the debunking. I will give some preliminary comments at the end of this probably, but otherwise the debunking, quote unquote, will be happening in like the final part, when I take my findings from this stream and the one after this and apply it to Roman apologetics and theology. So this is going to be, that's when it's going to mainly happen. Otherwise, we'll give some comments here. Chivalry, make the papists squirm. To be honest, I don't know if you'll fully be comfortable with my conclusions either, but I guess we'll have to see. But yes, and that's not my aim. That's not my aim to make the papists squirm. The only reason why I like getting on the nerves of papists is for the sake of truth. So yeah, mine Ben, my buddy, good to see you. John Bugay, absolute flipping legend. Massive help on this, by the way. He was a huge help on this. I thank you so much, buddy. Thank you so much. Drusselstein, hey, first live stream that I watched live. Very good. Best one, actually, honestly. What's up? Oh, hang on. Very excited to see what you come up with. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, I'm not going to dilly-dally for too much longer, but as usual, Q&A at the end of this. So, and because there's a ton of people watching, a lot of people are going to give questions. So if you want to guarantee that your question will be asked, either send through a super chat or become a monthly supporter on Subscribestar for, hang on, right here. This is the link for any amount, and you will be able to ask priority questions that I will answer first. Oh my gosh, thank you so much again, man. Bummer. I am into Canadian apologetics, not Roman. Oh, rip. That's a shame. Oh well, no Catholic answers for you. Oh man. Hello, Pogo. Good to see you, buddy. Supreme Pirate King. A Roman Apollo argues that according to their theology would be null and void if Francis rejects their reasoning. We'll have to see about that. Oh man, Gabriel, time to justify my Presbyterian oath, mate. Hey, I called my other big stream on Clement the Presbyterian for a reason, right? Now I'm gonna pull up my slides in just a second. Oh, I've got to actually download them. That's right, yeah. So I've got to download them as Microsoft PowerPoint because I made them on Google Docs. Yep, cool, got them. Open it up. Whoops, hang on. What's it doing? Hang on. I'm just gonna open up, and then I've got to actually whatchamacallit. Why can't I open it as a PowerPoint document? Hang on. Download. Plain text. PNG. Scalable vector. Oh, is it because of the dumb Office thing? I think that's actually why. Because of dumb Microsoft Office. Hang on. Welcome to your new office. Shut up, bro. I do not care. Me when Paul debunks the Pope, man. Me when Paul debunks the Monepiscopacy. How long have you been live for? 7 minutes so far, and I don't want to go for too much longer before starting because it's just this dumb PowerPoint thing on Microsoft. Bro, I do not care. Just let me open a bloody PowerPoint. Is that so hard to do? Upload to OneDrive first. Uploading to OneDrive. Couple more seconds. Won't be a second longer, people. Just a couple more seconds, rather. So I've got to upload to OneDrive before I can open it up. That is. Oh, and I have to log in. You know what? Stuff it. We're not doing that. We're going to do it straight from Google Drive. We're doing it live. I'm not going to repeat the rest of that. Oh, man. Arrange tools, add-ons, help. Okay, you know what? Let's go to the start. Slideshow. Okay. Hang on, I got to put it in a separate window to make it work. Actually, what am I doing? I can just upload slides. Yeah. What am I doing? That's what I'm supposed to do with whatchamacallit. Add Google Slides. Sign in. Allow. Okay. There we go. Woo! We got it, boys. We got it. Okay, it's up. It's just processing. Sorry, people who are watching. I hope it hasn't. I hope this hasn't dissuaded too many people, but it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. Trust me. Is it okay to say debunk with a hard U? In my channel, that's always okay. How was church this morning? It was lovely. It was nice and godly, nice and spiritually refreshing. It was great stuff. I loved it as usual. Of course, got my trusty tea here, ready to go as soon as the slides finish processing. But yes, see that link below here on the band here, and also on the in the description. You can support me monthly, and you'll get priority questions. You just got to join. In order for me to see them, you got to join the Discord with your role through Subscribestar, and you'll be able to go to the supporter questions section, which will separate your questions from everybody else. So I'll be able to tell and all that jazz. This is taking its sweet time to process. This is why I had to finish some stuff on the slides last minute, which is why I had to push it back 5 minutes. And I swear this better actually load. Like, seriously, what is going on with this? It's taking its time. It really is. When you tell me to pay, I'm going to watch for free even harder. Based. All my content is super free. Anything that's for supporters, payment, whatever. Here we go. We got it. That's all just, it's all extras. It's nice extras, but fundamentally, my content is free and I'm going to keep it that way. Anyway, people, we are finally here. The early Roman Episcopacy and the Petrine office, a comprehensive analysis, part 1 of at least 2. The second part of this, which I'll be scheduling for much later, lots of prep and study for that, is going to be on the Petrine office specifically, whether Christ established a special Petrine office according to the Roman categories. So that's going to be best. Free like the gospel, indeed. Anyway, minimal chat interaction now. Keep yourself civil. Don't do anything that will force me to stop my presentation, to address you and ban you or time you out or whatever. God willing, this is going to be great. Anyway, here's some preliminaries. These are the important preliminaries. And this is the key thing where I'm going to establish the issues of categories, interpretations, so on and so forth, and really clear up a lot of messes. I have to put on gloves. It is actually so cold here that that just confuses this topic a lot. Actually, that kind of looks lame. I don't need gloves. Anyway, first plug. This is one of my biggest research things ever done on the channel. One of my biggest research presentations, productions on the channel. I intend to do them like consistently, like one over across long periods of time, of course, but consistently on this channel. Pastor Brooks, mate, good to see you. Good to see you. And this is made possible by financial supporters. It really is. I'm actually on the way to making this at least a side hustle with my financial supporters, and I thank them so much. I've already passed the first goal for my monthly support in order to, and I'm working on the things that were for it right now. I didn't expect it to happen that fast. And we're really close to the second goal, which will allow me to withdraw monthly from Subscribestar, because you have to have a minimum in your account before you can withdraw. And so the next goal is going to be at the amount that will allow me to withdraw consistently every month. So if you believe in my mission, you want to help make these big research things possible, you can support me right here at any amount with various bonuses. And I'll give a shout out now to all my current supporters right now. Absolute legends. Without this, without them, I wouldn't be doing this at all, or at bare minimum at a much slower pace. So this is my census patronorum, my census of supporters or patrons, technically. So from the Patriarches tier, the highest tier, we have Chivery Bob, Brad H, and Macrum Orthochog Anglicana. Absolute legends. Thank you so much. In the Diakonos tier, we have Andy Bales, Fezzik, and E Cinque. Thank you guys as well. Means so much. And in the Pistos tier, we have Mindbend, Jack Ray, Tiffany, Brian D, and UNG. All of you Pistos people, thank you so much. The Pistoi, the Diakonoi, and the Patriarchai. I forgot the plural. I don't know. Thank you all so much, guys. Seriously, you're absolutely amazing. I cannot thank you enough. This is awesome stuff. You make all of this possible for me. You guys are the foundation of me turning this eventually into a job once I get enough support. It's gonna be fantastic. Really. Thank you so much. Now, whoops, that was a little third thing there, but I didn't mean to keep it there. The main goals for this stream are as follows. First, to come to as firm of an answer as possible with sound historical method on the structure of the Roman Church in the earliest period, particularly its hierarchy, using sources from the 1st and 2nd centuries. And number 2, to expose and rectify common areas of perspective and interpretation in Protestant-Catholic dialogue on the issue. That's what's happening. And before I continue, let me just say, live now, just putting up a last tweet to tell people that we are happening right now. And done. Okay, anyway, no more of that. So those are my basic goals of the stream. That's what everything is focused on. Everything to come along is focused on this. And notice this. One of the goals is not debunk the Romanists. That comes later. But no, this stream is fundamentally focused on a positive case as well as critique of the idea of a monepiscopacy, but not strictly a polemic against Rome and against the papacy and all that stuff. This is just laying groundwork, foundations, and all that. Yeah, that's pretty much that. So the structure of the presentation is as follows, and I'll say first the whole section for archaeological data, kind of misleading because I eventually found that, like, look, I could go a bunch of detail on the archaeological data, but it doesn't really affect a whole ton except for just some basic considerations. So it's actually pretty brief, my take on the archaeology. So you can kind of ignore that. But otherwise, the structure today is going to be Prolegomena, and then the hypotheses and the Roman claims, so actually defining what we're talking about. Second section is contextual data. Third section is the main one, the primary source analysis, and then evaluation of hypotheses, and then the conclusions. That's how we're going to be going through today. And Jack, one of my faithful supporters, lovely to see you here, buddy. I hope you enjoy this. I hope you learn a thing. Hope you learn a lot. So, Prolegomena. 1, contextualizing evidence. So, this is one of the biggest problems in this topic. So categories and interpretive lenses of evidence are established by prior sources. That's what we must do. This is necessary and very helpful because we are dealing with concepts, institutions, and literary sources from a specific religious group in a very specific period. That is the early Christians from the 1st and 2nd century. And so it is necessary that our categories are actually defined by those sources, if of course they can define them, which I'm going to show that they actually can. Basic definitions, granted, but still good category establishment nonetheless. So, for example, early sources X and Y establish these categories that allow us to interpret the later source Z. And this is a key problem in these discussions. And I will say, especially for the Romanists, although Protestants aren't free of this either, Protestants can make some pretty big slip ups in this as well, where they will primarily resort to what they currently understand as the idea of a bishop, for example, or a presbyter, or apostolic succession. This is really the core problem of this entire debate. And then they'll say, "Oh, look at that! So now we're going to read this source, and oh, look at that! They mention this word which is used for the category I know, so therefore my category applies." And this very often happens without people noticing. Even otherwise highly educated people, like certain Roman apologists, like I'll just name them straight up: Joe Heschmeyer, not as he doesn't really deal with this as much, but kind of Michael Lofton, Swansona, Trent Horn, pretty much all of them when they delve into this, because they have to do that. And this is not, if any of you guys are watching, that's not shade, that's genuine critique. Love you guys, you're awesome, especially Swan, really intelligent guy, younger than me, freaking awesome lad. But yeah, there's mistakes that are made, and it's unfortunate. So we must, and that is what this presentation does, work with the categories that these sources themselves are working with. And what's especially helpful for this is that there is an objective set of texts upon which everyone, including the authors of later sources themselves, base their beliefs on, and that is the apostolic text. And so we are able to get their categories, and then diachronically go through the historical record, see how they're used, how they possibly change, because this is an important thing too. The opposite problem is also possible, where you establish your categories historically, but then you're so rigid with them that you end up forcing later sources that otherwise do genuinely change things up, and forcing them into that lens, and then coming up to an incorrect conclusion. And so we have to avoid that extreme either as well. And yes, we'll see that in today's presentation as well. Number 2, kinds of evidence. So another issue, I'm going to distinguish between evidence and compatible data. So evidence points specially towards and or against a certain hypothesis. For example, water all over the ground. So, and I don't just mean like on a specific section, but like everywhere, like on your front porch, on the road, in the grass and all that. Water all over that prefers a recent rain, as in rain just recently fell, over someone spilling liters upon gallons and gallons of cups of water across those areas. The rain hypothesis is much simpler, makes much more sense of it. Requires less assumptions than someone just constantly spilling water in such a short period of time. So that's an example of evidence. Compatible data is compatible with a hypothesis, but does not necessitate it or strongly prefer it over another. So, for example, a puddle of water in a shaded front deck is maybe compatible with recent rain, assuming the angle of the deck isn't too sharp. But it's also compatible with someone spilling a cup of water. So this is kind of akin to circumstantial evidence in law. And yeah, all data fits on some kind of spectrum between these categories. And I want to add as well, there is sometimes data that's just straight up evidence. But yeah, we're dealing qualitatively here, not quantitatively. Like data, evidence and data, historical sources don't come with little numbers that define mathematically their evidential rating. That's not how it works. We're dealing with qualitative data, so we use qualitative method. And yeah, so big problem in the online discussions is how this distinction is very rarely appreciated. So again, I'll point to the Romanist, where they'll sometimes say, yes, okay, look, so it's true that, let's say, the Shepherd of Hermas, it mentions multiple elders and all that. So okay, we'll say that's true. But that's not incompatible with a monarchical episcopate. There could be one of those elders who's superior to all the others. And so therefore the monarchical episcopate, we got evidence for it. or at bare minimum. So it's an acceptable way of looking at this. So this does happen, not crazy often, thankfully, but it does sometimes happen where compatible data can sometimes be conflated as direct evidence, which is bad. Thankfully, again, not insanely common. Okay, I have to highlight this. CSI Ancient Church. Ain't that true? Ain't that absolutely true? But yes, so even if one grants that you can say, hey, look, this is compatible, this thing is compatible, this source rather is compatible with my hypothesis, and all that does at best is establish that you don't have a defeater. Congratulations, your hypothesis can account for it. That's not evidence for your hypothesis. And this is why it's so important to establish what the categories that these sources are working with at the outset, all right? Because it could still end up becoming the case that even if your hypothesis is technically compatible with most or even all the data, if your hypothesis throws in categories and assumptions that are otherwise never attested when they should be expected, that does end up being a form of cumulative evidence against the hypothesis. But again, we'll get into that later. So a little bit more on compatible data. Not enough to draw a technical compatibility between the words in a source, especially if they're translated, and a hypothesis, but a conceptual compatibility in essential elements. This is key. Really, really, really key. It goes on what I just said. So perfect example, person A says, beans are healthy for you. And then he cites person B as support, who says the exact same words, beans are healthy for you. But with further context, you end up seeing that person B is referring to canned beans, while person A is referring to jelly beans. So they are saying two very different things with the same word. Very key, very key. Keep that in mind once we get to the discussions on bishop, episcopos, etc. Look at any number of Roman apologetics videos on this very topic, and you'll see what I mean. You'll see what I mean. So number 4, direct versus indirect contradiction. This is going to be key for the value evaluation at the end of this. So necessary distinction. Direct contradiction is one piece of data directly contradicts a hypothesis or a necessary element of such. So not something that might be expected, but is actually necessary to the hypothesis. So example number 1, hypothesis, every single swan in Australia is white. Data, one or more black swans in Australia. Direct contradiction, no way around it. Example number 2, if this clump is sodium, it will react with water. Data, the clump does not react with water. So a necessary element of the hypothesis is that the clump will react to water. And because it doesn't, that necessary consequence of the hypothesis is refuted, and then by extension, the hypothesis itself is refuted. Now, an indirect contradiction is actually where most of the discussion is going to be over. Virtually all the discussion is going to be over, and it's much more, it's a bit more tricky and involved. So that's when data appears to present a different reality to what the hypothesis expects without strictly denying the core. So this can be far trickier. Well, I say far trickier, but depends on the context. Can be far trickier to demonstrate and does require a lot of extra care. Works very closely with the argument from silence, which I'll address in a second. And there can be varying levels of indirect contradiction. So one example is hypothesis, Thomas the Tank Engine is Mark's favorite toy. And the data is Mark has consistently played with Action Man more than Thomas. Now, whatchamacallit? Thomas the Tank Engine. Hang on, my mind just went blank. Sorry. So Mark consistently playing with Thomas the Tank Engine more than Action Man is more expected, is something that is expected, we can say, for all else being equal, key emphasis, all else being equal, that this is expected if Thomas the Tank Engine is Mark's favorite toy. But it's not strictly necessary to the theory, because there may be another factor for why that is the case. Nonetheless, absent any other such factor, you can say on a probabilistic level that Thomas the Tank Engine is not Mark's favorite toy. Probably. Anyway. So, next. Number 5 on silence. Poorly understood across the board. Almost no discussion on the proper criteria for silence. I say almost none because some people start to talk about it a little bit more, but I like to emphasize it a lot because it is actually a key tool of history, and it just drives me up the wall when I hear time and time again people just say, oh, that's an argument from science. That's an argument from science. And then go on to use one themselves. So we need to establish when is science significant and when is it a nothing burger, right? Whatchamacallit. So my criteria are as follows. First, the author would have known of the given idea or the hypothesis. And two, the author would have certainly mentioned it in the text in question, given the circumstances. And this I mainly get from A Guide to Historical Method by Father Gilbert Garrigan. Fantastic book. Good luck finding it, but it is great stuff. And there's a sub-criteria I have to point number 2, which I learned from Dr. David Falk in my interview with him. That is not strictly necessary, but it helps a lot. A lot. So the author makes mention of a different idea in place of the one in question. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a contradictory idea, just a different idea. So you expect in this text, in this context, that an author will make mention or use of an idea, concept, whatever, and rather than actually mention it at all, they actually mention or make use of a different concept altogether. And this will be something that we end up saying later on in the presentation. So something else also to consider is cumulative silences. So consistent silences where a proposed idea, I'll say, should be present or at minimum expected to be present, even if on an individual case-by-case level, the source can be technically reconciled with the data. But altogether, a accumulation of silences can grow into a powerful silence in itself. So, and this is likewise the case with many soft, or I meant to say indirect contradictions. So multiple indirect contradictions, even if case by case can be resolved, can end up forming a larger argument, a larger reason against a certain hypothesis. Here's interesting. So as stated, hypothesis example 2 is technically still plausible since it's stated as a conditional. So, the hypothesis itself is that the clump is sodium. So I do word it as if the clump is sodium, it will react with water. The clump does not react with water. So, okay. So I might have worded that a little bit wrong, but I'm supposed to say reword it as the clump is sodium, and as a necessary consequence, it will react with water. And then the data is the clump does not react with water. Therefore, the hypothesis is, yeah, that's true. Sorry, I stated it as a conditional. Technically, this conditional is correct. But so I word it as an absolute. So the clump is sodium, it will react with water. So mean it like that. And yes, autism in G, but that's good autism. Thank you very much. Thank you for pointing that out, mine, Ben. I will probably edit the slide after this. Okay, now number 6 this is another big one too, particularly from Romanists. And you know what? I think they do have good points here. I think there's consistently too much skepticism from the Protestant side. So trusting of certain sources, in this case, particularly Irenaeus and Hegesippus, is central to this debate. Okay, but consistent historical method must trust an authenticated source until given good reason to the contrary. That's key, because the only other 2 options we have is either to default to skepticism, which would then eviscerate all historical knowledge that we have, because fundamentally with all forms of communication, we place a fairly significant degree of trust, and not for bad reason at all, because generally, just from experience, generally humans are honest and our senses are reliable. If they weren't, just in everyday communication, for example, and messaging and all that stuff, if they weren't, our civilization would collapse. Simple as that. And then the other way to go is that you arbitrarily choose what sources to trust and to distrust at the outset. That's the atheist polemicist against Holy Scripture. We are historians. There's a wide chasm of difference between them. So we're not going to do that. And so the only consistent historical method, and really not just historical method, but just means of basic human investigation, relationship, and all that stuff, is to trust a source until given good reason to the contrary. That reason can take many forms. That can take the form of evidence. It can take the form of evaluating the circumstances and all, and seeing that given these conditions doesn't seem quite right what the source is saying. all that jazz. So we have to start with trust, and that's what I will be doing. Sources should therefore be trusted on claims until given good reason to the contrary. Moderate attempts to reconcile sources in tension is also necessary, permissible, and all that, until the point where the reconciliation does violence to the text or the context, in which case you will be forced to admit, okay, this source got something wrong. So that's pretty simple in my opinion. And so the Romanists will probably like this because, as I said, lots and lots and lots of Protestants love to cast a ton of shade on Irenaeus, for example. Not without cause entirely, because he does get some things wrong. One big thing in particular with the age of Jesus. Nonetheless, he went to Rome. He conversed with many people. He lives very close to the apostles. He is still nonetheless a very valuable source. Without good reason to the contrary, we should trust what he says. Simple as that. Now, 7, another big one, against supposition. There's a lot of unwarranted appeals to supposition in this topic. Again, from the Romanists. I have to say, I'm really sorry. Because tell me if this sounds familiar. Well, this text could be reconciled with X if we suppose Y and maybe Z, A, B, C, D, and all that stuff. With X being the hypothesis and Y being an assumption that's not warranted by the text. And I'll add also the context. So that could include prior texts that establish categories and all that. And at best, this works for removing defeaters. At best, that's it. If warranted by other evidence, or if not, perhaps at least not contradicted. Which, again, there's direct contradiction, indirect contradiction, all that stuff. So, without such, the supposition is pure fideism. There's no way around that. A conclusion in search for evidence. And I see that a lot, unfortunately. Now, this presentation is returning ad fontes and building understanding from there. Ad fontes, that is to the sources. We are returning to the sources and building our categories, our assumptions from there. And as a result, this is something I am calling on everybody in this chat to do. Clear your minds of prior presuppositions, of prior rather categories, assumptions, and all that on the issue of monarchic bishops versus plural bishops versus apostolic succession, all that stuff. Clear your mind of these. We are doing a fresh look at these sources. And yeah, God willing, that should reveal a thing or two for all of us here. It will be nice and enlightening because I'm certain myself, like, even though I've looked at all this stuff quite a bit before, which is why I've been able to put this together much quicker than otherwise I would have. Nonetheless, doing this full diachronic method has opened up my mind's eye a little bit more and shown, things aren't as obvious in this as is the case as was previously supposed, or this is actually a little bit more obvious than I thought, and all that stuff. So yeah, diachronic investigation, beautiful that way, absolutely beautiful. Now, final preliminaries, I'll be posting the full bibliography and editions of primary sources sometime after this presentation. Now, after half an hour of Prolegomena, we have part 1, ladies and gentlemen. This entire presentation is part 1. So yeah, a comprehensive investigation of early Roman ecclesiology. If you've got your snacks, ladies and gentlemen, and you haven't started nibbling into them now, crack open that chip bag right now. The real stuff is getting started. So, the hypotheses and the Roman claim. Clarifying the hypotheses. So, this is really big. I want to consider this one of my biggest contributions to the dialogue, this point right here. The debate is often regarded as between two positions, a monarchic or a monoepiscopacy versus a plural episcopacy. But I want to submit that there is an unacknowledged distinction between a monarchic episcopate, that is truly one bishop, versus an archepiscopacy, which is multiple real bishops, but with one preeminent member above the rest. And this is really important because there's fundamental differences between these concepts, particularly with respect to Roman theology, wherein one bishop alone possesses apostolic succession over a diocese. And multiple people have said, but auxiliary bishops and all that, they're titular bishops, or at least most of the time. I don't know if this is always the case, but as far as I'm aware, they're titular bishops of another diocese that they can't get to for some reason. They do not possess the apostolic succession for a diocese that they're working in. World of difference. Anyway, and I'll address that in the third part because I don't want to go into that too much right here. But yes, so there's a difference. So now I'm going to define these hypotheses with some depth here. So plural episcopacy, confederation of multiple bishops and overseers with no particular head. At best, maybe there's some guy who's like informally well regarded above the others, but that's like the extent of it. Archepiscopacy is a confederation of bishops and presbyters with bishops/presbyters or overseers, whatever, with a preeminent member collectively, but nonetheless, they are all collectively supreme over the church. So yeah, preeminent member, and that could be in a variety of ways. It could be through direct authority as a chairman of the board or as a chief representative and all that. All of the above. It could be in many of those ways. But the point is, the key thing is that the supreme authority of the church is still fundamentally in the collective bishopric. A monepiscopacy, in the true sense in Roman theology, is one bishop above lower subordinates, even if those other subordinates are technically bishops, but otherwise there is still really one bishop in the church who alone possesses supreme authority over that church. And this, therefore, entails entirely distinct natures between the bishop and subordinate presbyters / subordinate other bishops. Whereas in an archepiscopacy, they're still fundamentally all bishops, but one bishop just has some extra privileges above the others for whatever they are. And so I'll quote a beautiful summary here from the Catholic Encyclopedia, the 1907 edition. The episcopate is monarchical. By the will of Christ, the supreme authority in a diocese does not belong to a college of priests or of bishops, but it resides in the single personality of the chief. And so this is the picture we want to draw here. Archepiscopacy, power concentrated in the collective, and then some measure of that power flows up to the archepiscopate, the archbishop. Versus a monepiscopacy, where power is fundamentally centered in the one bishop alone and then flows down to the lower orders. That is why, for example, it is the norm that a lower holy order cannot ordain a higher holy order. That's just you just don't do that in Rome. That just doesn't happen. And this isn't just quoting some random aberrant Roman Catholic source, nor to say that I claim that it's infallible either, but I do consider it significant to note that this Catholic encyclopedia did receive the Nihil Obstat, nothing to object to, by Remy Lefort, STD. Oh my gosh. And a censor, as well as the Imprimatur by John M. Farley, the Archbishop of New York. Archbishop. Very interesting. So, burn these distinctions into your mind here. The debate is not between a plural episcopacy or a monepiscopacy, but a plural episcopacy, monepiscopacy, and an archepiscopacy. Or perhaps even just an archepiscopacy if you're someone like me and grant that there may have been some kind of head bishop since the very beginning, because I am quite sympathetic to that, actually, just by the fact of human nature, just how organizations work by nature. So this is where the debate actually lies. When a Roman thinker, a Roman apologist, and I'm not using apologist as a pejorative, by the way. It's just what they are. I'm an apologist. But I specify apologist because this dialogue and debate is specifically certain points are specifically forwarded by them in this dialogue and debate. So Roman apologists, some will like to say that it's true, sure, maybe we have multiple bishop presbyters, but there's still one who's above the others, therefore monepiscopacy. No. That's not how that works. That's an archepiscopacy at best. Monepiscopacy is fundamentally different. And I won't go too much more into this. That's going to be particularly emphasized in the third stream, where I actually deal with Roman apologetics and Roman theology proper. So I'll go into much more detail here, but nonetheless, this suffices. There is a fundamental distinction between an archepiscopacy and a monepiscopacy. So burn that into your brain. This is one of the most important things you can get out of this presentation. Now, I've got 30 viewers. How good. So now we'll start with some contextual data. And so as I said, remember what I said at the very beginning, that we're going to begin with establishing categories ad fontes, or rather ab fontibus, from the sources. We're going to establish them, or ex fontibus rather, ex fontibus. We're going to be establishing those categories from the sources first and foremost, and we're in a unique position to do that because, again, the Christian religion is foundationally established by the apostles who wrote things, and so what we can learn from them, we can take as key definitions of categories, particularly with regards to church offices, which they did establish. So, to begin with, necessary to establish earliest context and definitions, so such as like the episcopos versus the presbyteros, or the plurality of the episcopae versus one, etc., etc. Now, this will provide the categories for which to interpret Roman data of the same period. So reading in, as I mentioned before, reading in current categories regarding bishops, presbyters / priests, hierarchy, the church, etc., is by definition eisegesis, unless a category accidentally aligns with its ancient conception. And as I said, very common, happens all the time. People simply assume what they mean, what they understand of a bishop or apostolic succession or presbyter, all that jazz when they get into this topic, even the highest tier of Roman apologists, in my opinion. They'll assume that and then point to something that mentions, hey, look, bishop versus presbyters. So they'll see, for example, Irenaeus, and I do believe that Irenaeus does this. Irenaeus distinguishes between a bishop and presbyters. And then they'll say, hey, look, monepiscopacy. But as I just established earlier, there's some very particular conceptual categories in a monepiscopacy that that Irenaeus does not necessarily reflect. So monepiscopacy will not be given, and I'll get into that later. JK, I just went to morning prayer, mate. I just came back from that. So yeah. Holberg, my man, good to see you. And oh yeah, Jeff, a goy for Jesus, my man. Lovely to see you here as well, man. So happy you could join. Oh crap, I forgot to post this on Facebook. I'm gonna have to do that maybe later on. Oh well. So clear your mind of the prior debates. We are returning ad fontes, to the sources, and building our understanding from there. I do not know why I put that in twice. And really quickly, because I know Jeff said he wanted to do something with my post for the for this stream. So really quickly, I'm just going to go over to my page and do a proper post. I'll make it. I'll make it a little bit later. Stuff it. Okay. Anyway, E5, what up, man? Again, yeah, you're already here from the beginning. Lol. Okay, so now here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at first, what offices did the apostles establish for the church, the normative offices. And so this is very simply clear, very clear. And I don't take seriously comments that say otherwise, particularly from the Romanists. Church offices that are established by the apostles are the overseer, the episcopos, and the deacon, the diakonos. So we have the key text really that shows this is Paul's own qualification list in 1 Timothy chapter 3, where personal standards are provided for those aspiring to the episcopate or the diaconate. And I'll read them right here. So 1 Timothy chapter 3. This saying, or the saying, is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. And by the way, I'm using the ESV unless stated otherwise. Sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, blah, blah, and so on and so forth, all those criteria. And then, next section, deacons must likewise be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. So on and so forth. And note as well, Paul distinguishes between deacons and their wives. So female deacons debunked. Sorry, libtards and fellow Anglicans in certain areas of Sydney, unfortunately. But yes, so this is key. And likewise, the testimony of Clement attests to this, or demonstrates this as well. And as I'll argue a bit later on, a bit difficult to see blue text. Oh yeah, don't worry. I realize that now. This is like one of the only areas where I use blue text, so it won't be, shouldn't be an issue anymore after this, except for one or two other slides maybe. Anyway, so the testimony of Clement, and why I include this is because I believe the evidence is extremely strong that this was written prior to AD 70, and I'm going to present that evidence later on, but I will primarily point people as well to my first Clement presentation, where I go into the greatest detail on that. So I won't do all that here. But yes, I believe that, and that likewise, he may well likely be the Clement that Paul names as one of his companions. Or if not, at bare minimum, encountered the apostles somehow, somewhere, heard their teaching, all that stuff. And so his testimony is highly significant, highly significant. And so I'll read from verse 4 of chapter 42 of his letter, First Clement. Or is it really his letter? I'll talk about that a little bit later. So from verse 4, it says, "So, preaching both in the country and in the towns, they, the apostles, appointed their first fruits when they had tested them by the Spirit to be bishops and deacons," or overseers and deacons. So, is episcopus kai diakonus, for the future believers. And this was no new thing they did, for indeed something had been written about bishops and deacons many years ago. For somewhere thus says the scripture, "I'll appoint their bishops in righteousness and their deacons in faith." And so, yeah, interesting. He appeals to the Greek Septuagint edition of a passage from Isaiah in order to say, hey, this has some precedent in the past. So very, very interesting indeed. Of course, all the normies who deny typology in the universe are like, oh, but that wasn't addressing the same thing. Typology bad. Yeah, whatever. Typological method is based. So yes, point being, it's clear. Very clear. Clement likewise attests, as per the Apostle Paul, that the apostles established two offices, not one, not four, not 12, but two offices, the overseer and the deacon. And this is simply further elucidated in other references in the New Testament, where you simply see those two groups if the leadership is addressed, because the word bishop, or at least episkopos and its verb form combined, and episcope, the episcopate, collectively only used around, actually no, episkopos itself is used around 5 times. They're not used a whole lot in the New Testament, but it does happen by God's providence that where they are used, there's some very good descriptions that allow us to establish basic categories. So that's very good for us, very, very good for us. And do remember, people, by the way, at the very end, we will have a Q&A. That's going to be epic. And again, as I said, if you want priority questions, you can support me for any amount on Subscribestar. And you'll be able to get priority questions across all streams, or you can send a one-off super chat with your question, all that jazz. Because I expect a lot of people to to be asking questions. Typologies are based, but it's hard to use them to establish doctrines and provide guidelines. Yeah, that's absolutely true. 100% agree. Now, thankfully here, Clement isn't like establishing it here. For him, the establishment of those offices is the apostles established them. But then he's saying, hey, look, there's some precedent for this in the Greek Septuagint. So, yeah. Now, with Episcopos itself, won't go too crazy into it, but there's a number of uses depending on the context. It could be someone who's a scout, for example, or as per in ecclesial context, a supervisor, as attested in, I believe that's from Aristotle's use towards the bottom there. Supervisors who are sent from the Athenian government to subject states. So that can kind of be one of the closer ideas of an episcopos in the Christian church. Like the episcopos is kind of God's guardian, God's representative to guide the people into truth. But yeah, so variety of uses, and it establishes at least a bare minimum baseline idea that there's someone with a responsibility to overlook and protect something, perhaps with the use of authority as well. And this is made clear in the Christian texts themselves. So as I said, this is the first paragraph I quoted already. First paragraph of the section I quoted already from 1 Timothy 3, but I want to focus on a particular section as well, because I want to address something. I want to address a comment particularly by Joe Heschmeyer, where he said, in his response to Dr. Gavin Ortland, that he responds to Ortland's comment that, hey, the papacy not being in the Bible is like the president not being mentioned by the Constitution. And then he says, then Joe Heschmeyer mentions, well, actually, the roles of bishop and deacon are not actually very well defined by Scripture. They had assumed certain categories, and so that doesn't actually mean much. You can't really get what those roles do in Holy Scripture. Now, and so therefore that objection doesn't actually mean a whole ton. And therefore sola scriptura doesn't work. And to which I'll simply say, for one, that's that doesn't refute simply something not being in Scripture doesn't make sola scriptura wrong, but that's a whole other topic. But second of all, I haven't investigated the variety of uses of diakonos quite yet throughout the Scriptures, but I have looked at episkopos, and I actually quite contend that actually, whereas not super specific, we do get a very good and clear picture as to the nature and the fundamental role of the episkopos in Holy Scripture. So I do highly challenge Heschmeyer on that. And so we can see this through a few key statements, a couple mainly. So for one, Paul says he must manage his own household well, this is the red text, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? So that's very key right there. That we get a very key idea of what the episcopos is supposed to be. And I'll explain it after. But next passage would be in Paul's letter to Titus. So we see in the red text, so he's mentioning the presbyteroi, the elders, and the episcopoi, the overseers, clearly synonymous, as I'll show later. But at the end here, the very end of red text, Paul says, so that he, the episcopos, may be able to give instruction, parakalin, in sound doctrine, and also rebuke those who contradict it. And I forgot to put the Greek for rebuke there, but oh well. So that's another clear thing we get here. He has a role of instructing the people in truth, in sound doctrine, and rebuking those who contradict it. That alone is quite clear as to the basic role. Now, next passage, small bit from Acts 20:28, when Paul is talking to the overseers, plural, of Ephesus. And so Paul says, pay attention to yourselves and to all the flock, pomnion, in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, episkopos, to care for, boimainin, the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. Now, the ESV doesn't make it clear, but to care for, boimainin, is in reference to shepherding sheep. So literally shepherd the church of God. So we get two images primarily. Actually, I'll look at the main conclusion myself. So 5 points here to show the nature of the episkopos just from the New Testament text with necessary linguistic context. So just from the linguistic context and the passage that follow, he has some kind of authority of the local church. Point 2, he leads the local church in some way similar to the father of a household. So he manages the household just like he manages his children, he manages the church. And we can see the logic that follows from that. And point 3, he leads the local church as shepherds lead over a flock. And 4, he instructs the faithful and rebukes false teachers. So all those things work together. Shepherds have authority over their sheep in that they guide their sheep away from the bad and towards the good. And so that's the summary right there. In sum, the episkopos is responsible for leading the faithful to the truth of God. And by necessity, through these passages, he has some level of authority over them with respect to interchurch life. And so, contra Heschmeyer, we actually get a very good foundational picture of the episkopos. Now, obviously, we don't get some set of canon laws about his exact powers and what to do in this and that and all that stuff. So what? Does not matter. These are the fundamental principles upon which the episkopos is based. And so we can say that actually, yes, we have a good idea of the role of the episkopos just from the New Testament text alone. But again, that's not what Sola Scriptura claims anyway. So even if we didn't, whatever, who cares? But this is what's actually next. Okay, so this is important. So what I've just done here is established our first key category of the episkopos. So I've just summarized their role in accordance with the apostolic text, those who actually establish the office itself. So it is a key leader within the Christian community, within the Christian congregation, with the fundamental purpose of shepherding the flock towards the truth of God. And by extension, so he instructs them and he rebukes those who go against it. And that's pretty much that basic role, the one who shepherds the Holy Church, the local church of God. So that's our basic category we're working with right here. Now, obviously, many things are not said that are assumed in Roman ecclesiology. And I'm not going to say, therefore the Roman episcopacy made up later invention. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying this is the categories that we're working with when we look at these later sources who rely on the same apostolic texts and somewhat other apostolic testimony as well, but nonetheless fundamentally on these texts, these categories. by which to discuss the episkopos and the presbyteros. And on the presbyteros, this one's a bit more different because it is much, 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 much more common than the episkopos in the apostolic text. And much wider use, much wider semantic range. So it can be a generic term for the elderly in contrast to the young. So, for example, 1 Timothy 5:1 and Acts 2:17. And then it can be used for ancestors, so Matthew 15:2 or Hebrews 11:2. It can be the elders of the Sanhedrin. So you see that throughout the Gospels. It could also be the church leaders themselves. So Acts 20:17 and 1 Peter 5:1. And with 1 Peter 5:1 in particular, that is in reference to both elders, but also Peter himself. He calls himself a fellow elder. So, in other words, that whatchamacallit? What's next? Okay. So, in other words, in the ecclesial context, this is key. In the ecclesial context, the terms refer to an identical group, with their main term, their main title being the episkopos or the episcopoi, plural. Now, the episkopos is the proper title, as shown by those texts which establish those roles, versus the fact that the term presbyteros, is used in many contexts, many contexts. So, my hypothesis is that the episkopos is the proper title, while as presbyteros describes the person with respect to their age, their seniority, and yet nonetheless refers to the same group in ecclesial context. So this neatly explains three distinct facts. So first one, the episkopos is used for a specific office. It doesn't really vary in its use, with the exception of Peter when he says that Jesus is the episkopos of our souls, so the guardian of our souls. That's the only exception. Whereas, apart from that, it is vast majority just in reference to the ecclesial leaders, the episcopoi. Whereas presbyteros is used in many contexts: the elderly, the Sanhedrin, the ancestors. But in ecclesial context, otherwise, it is the same group that have been entitled the episcopoi. And there's some texts that will be able to prove that from the apostolic text and also other texts. So, so another fact is B, in reference to ecclesial leaders, presbyteros is conflated with episkopos and not used side by side as reference to different groups, as the later sources do. That's key. That is actually really key right here. The later sources, particularly Irenaeus, and then well on, will, when discussing the church roles, mention the bishops, the presbyters, and the deacons. Irenaeus, but also Ignatius as well, the earliest use of that. But in the apostolic texts, the only offices that will be mentioned, if side by side even, will be the episcopoi and the diaconoi. So we have, for example, in Philippians, the very beginning of Philippians, where Paul says to the church of Philippi, with the episcopoi and the diaconoi, the bishops and the deacons. And then, of course, Paul's own qualifications list for the church offices, he mentions the episcopoi and the diaconoi, those two offices. And so in light of that, we see when presbyteros is used in the ecclesial context, we just so happen to have at least two areas where it's clear that this is in reference to the same group as the episkopos. And so we're going to see that here. So in Acts chapter 20, it says at the beginning, from Miletus, Paul, sent a message to Ephesus telling the elders, presbyteros, of the church to come to him. Now, later on in his speech to this same group, contra what other people say who like to speculate, maybe he's referring to to the specific bishops within the elders and all that. Pure speculation, no warrant from the text. He's referring to the same group here. He's telling the elders to come. They come. Now Paul is talking to the elders. And he says to them, watch out for yourselves and for all the flock of which, and this is the quote we mentioned earlier, of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, episkopos, to shepherd the church of God that he obtained with the blood of his own son. Notice how I used this passage prior already to partially establish a definition and role of an episkopos. And it is in this very same passage that is being addressed to the elders of Ephesus. So that was in Acts chapter 20, verses 17 and 28. Now, the second passage, the reason I left you, in talking to Titus, in Crete was to set in order the remaining matters and to appoint elders, presbyteros, in every town, as I directed you. An elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife, with faithful children who cannot be charged with dissipation or rebellion. For the overseer, episkopon, must be blameless as one entrusted with God's work, not arrogant, not prone to anger, not a drunkard, not violent, not greedy for gain. And the clearest, easiest way to explain this is that when you're using language like hire and appoint and all that, there's actually two objects. You're going to have your direct object and your indirect object. So your direct object is going to be the person that is hired or appointed, and the indirect object is what they're being appointed to. So, for example, we could in language we're able to we're kind of able to interchange those, and so it can be a bit vague. But this actually does best explain the text for why Paul uses presbyteros and then immediately after episkopos without saying, "Oh, he's a distinct group," by the way. So, for example, if you could say, oh, there was an analogy I just came up with recently, but you can do it in a billion different ways. But just to come off the top of my head, let's say you're a supervisor. You're a supervisor at a work site, or whoever. Do you supervise, hire the people? I'm really dumb. You're the guy that hires construction workers, right? Now, your boss is going to give you an order to hire people, but he could say two different things. He could either say, I want you to hire young men, or he could say, I want you to hire laborers. So young men, he could say, I'm hiring young men. They're the object. He's not hiring people to be young men. He is literally directly hiring young men in order to make them into laborers. Now, he could say, I want you to hire young men in order to emphasize, I want you to get young men, break them into the industry, but also they've got bigger energy, more strength and all that because they're younger men. Whereas if you want to say, I want you to hire laborers, that's emphasizing the fact of the roles that we need filled. We need laborers, right? And whereas you could also simply say, you could say both. I want you to hire young men as laborers. So do you see the point here? There's a direct object of appointment, that is the laborer, versus the indirect object of the office they're being appointed to. I'm sorry, it's the direct object, the young man, versus the direct object, the office they're being appointed to, the laborer. And that's what best explains this passage here, where Peter, because some people like to say, but if you don't believe presbyteros is an ecclesial title, because don't know if I mentioned it, but I say that presbyteros is not an ecclesial title, at least not straight away in the apostolic texts. Because some people have pointed to me, what about this? Paul's telling them to appoint elders. And my explanation is what actually makes best sense of the passage, really. That Paul is, the bottom passage, that Paul is hiring elders, direct object. He specifically wants Timothy to hire, to appoint the elderly men, the elders of a community, to the office of the overseer. And that's the indirect object. And that explains why, that explains why Paul seamlessly switches from one to another. Because if you want to posit, hey, look, there's two different groups here, that literally makes no sense. You can't make sense of it. There's no different groups here. Paul's simply telling Timothy to appoint elders. Why is he suddenly mentioning the episcopos out of nowhere? Why is he giving the exact same qualifications? It makes best sense because Paul is saying these are the qualities the elders that you hire require. For the overseer, these are the qualities that the overseer needs. That makes perfect sense. Paul is basing the qualities of the elders, those whom he wants Timothy to appoint, upon the qualities that he deems necessary to the office they're being appointed to, that is, the episcopate. That seamless reading of the passage, perfectly seamless reading of the passage. And in summary conclusion, there's simply no hint of a distinction of these offices in ecclesial context, no distinction of these terms at all when referring to the same, because they either refer to the same group or they're referring to a non-ecclesial group. At best, you could speculate that there are elders who are not appointed to the episcopate, all right? In which case, though, they're not in a church office anymore. They're just elders in the basic sense of the term. They're not actually in a church office anymore, because that is explicitly what Paul established as the church office, the episcopate, right? That's the role. And so if there's an elder in these categories who is not an episcopos, he's not in a church office, because Paul didn't give qualifications for the presbyteral office, okay? So that's what makes sense of this. Over time, slowly but surely, I'm taking less and less serious arguments for the episkopos presbyteros distinction in Holy Scripture, because it is just, in my opinion, really clear that is not the case. There is no distinction at all. there are two offices clearly established, episkopos, diakonos, notwithstanding the apostles themselves and all that jazz. Never is there a third office, a third holy order in the same category of episkopos, diakonos. Is there ever established in the apostolic text? And it's explicit when it simply says there's episkopos and diakonos. And of course, people could simply say, like with the Brian Cross type of argument, where he likes to say, oh, but it doesn't explicitly contradict this. They may end up saying, oh, it doesn't explicitly say that these are the only officers and all that. To which I could simply say, well, okay, fine. Now you have the same evidential basis as someone who wants to say that the apostles also established the God Emperor of mankind role in the church for every local church. And the fact that they don't mention it, that doesn't contradict it, because, hey, after all, the apostles don't say that they didn't establish a God Emperor of mankind role, and they didn't say that they only established the episkopos and diakonos. So therefore, there could have been a God Emperor of mankind role. And of course, me being slightly facetious, but otherwise that is actually true. The only kind of response that can be given is that, well, hang on. We have in the early church that there is the distinct role of presbyter that comes up fairly early, which of course is going to be addressed here. When does that distinction end up actually happening? And to what degree does that distinction end up happening? Point being, we have these categories here, very clear in Holy Scripture: episkopos and presbyteros, same group of people when referring to ecclesiastical context. When Paul's talking about the presbyteroi, or any of the apostles talking about the presbyteroi in the churches, and particularly those with authority, they are the episcopoi, as we clearly see from these two passages in particular. And I need not say more other than that, really. But also, of course, as shown earlier, the witness of Clement of Rome himself, where he explicitly says that they established the bishops and the deacons, the episcopoi, the episcopus, and the diakonos. Very clear. Two offices have been established by the apostles. And so these are the categories we have to work with respect to the nature of episcopos versus presbyteros and the officers of the church. These are the categories that we're working with from the apostolic text and the closest apostolic witness that we do have. If I wanted to, I could throw in the Didache itself, which mentions how there were the people are to appoint episcopoi and diakonoi, bishops and deacons. Not bishops, presbyters, and deacons, but bishops and deacons. I could throw that in as well, but because of the uncertainty of whenabouts that came, even though it's fairly certain that it's in the first century, but the exact provenance of it, I decided to leave it out just to maintain fairness. But either way, very, 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 very clear that the offices, the offices that were established by the apostles, and thus the categories we're working with. Anyway, now we're on to the primary source analysis. 1 hour in, and we're actually going to look at the sources. Bloody hell. Okay. So first one, and again, as I said at the beginning, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. There's the archaeological data. In sum, everybody relies on Lamp. Good old Lamp. For his book, From Paul to Valentinus, it is a definitive tome on Christian archaeology in Rome, like legit. Reading a few pages of it, stupidly dense, absolutely ridiculously dense, and has all these nice diagrams and that at the very bottom, at the very end of it. It's like, if you want to know anything, if you just want to become like a semi-expert on Roman ecclesial archaeology, Lamp. Go to Lamp. He's your guy. Talk to him. He's your boy. Get his book. So I'm not going to spend a whole ton of time on this, because like just from the archaeological data alone, there's not a whole ton of time. Not a whole ton that answers the question of what hypothesis to prefer, because every hypothesis can fit well with the archaeological data, because it's just buildings. It doesn't tell us about the nature of their hierarchy specifically. Nonetheless, what we do see is interesting. So we have clear phenomena of fractionation. So that is multiple centers of worship in Rome for the Christians, as evidenced, for example, not exclusively, but for example, by multiple concentrations of grave sites for Christians. There's also key concentrations of Christians in the regions of the Via Appia, the Via Lata Flaminia, and the Trastevere. So those are the main areas that, according to Lamp, the Christians concentrated in their living areas. And he mentions an interesting thing about how those areas just so happen to be among the few areas that weren't really touched badly by the Great Fire of Rome, which is very, very interesting. And because Nero allegedly blamed that on the Christians. So there's even archaeological evidence of Valentinian remains. So I believe mainly a gravestone was found, for example, that belonged to Valentinians, which is very interesting, very, very interesting, because the Gnostic school of Valentinus was quite strong in Rome, as we see. So again, as stated, nothing major or strictly conclusive from the archaeological data, but perhaps combined with the later data that we will see, it will raise some questions on whether there was an original monepiscopacy. But on its own, the archaeological data doesn't really tell us a whole ton. I need to take a drink. My throat's getting dry already. Wow. Only 33 slides through, not even halfway. Fantastic. Yes, Adam, you've been talking about this a lot. Finish the work from Peter Lamp. It is a great book. It is really, really good stuff. Yep. So, next. First literary source that we'll be dealing with is Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, I'm looking at it now. I'm genuinely surprised that Paul's letter to Rome is never addressed in these discussions. I'm genuinely surprised that, not that there's anything like earth-shattering from Paul's letters, but it does give some really good contextual data that gives us a baseline idea of the nature of the Roman Church and has some consequences for the hypotheses later on. So it's really interesting that it's never addressed, because here's the key passage here, the very last chapter of the letter to the Romans, one of the most neglected and yet historically valuable chapters in Paul's letter to Rome. He says the following: "Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. Greet also the church in their house." Keep that in mind. "Greet my beloved Epinetus, who was the first convert to Christ in Asia. Greet Mary, who has worked hard for you. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners. They are well known to the apostles, and they were in Christ before me. Greet Ampliatus, my beloved in the Lord. Greet Urbanus, our fellow co-worker in Christ, and my beloved Stachys. Greet Apelles, who is approved in Christ. Greet those who belong to the family of Aristobulus. Greet my kinsman Herodian. Greet those in the Lord who belong to the family of Narcissus. Greet those workers in the Lord, Tryphina and Tryphena, because I'm using classical pronunciation, Tryphina and Tryphosa. Greet the beloved Persis, who has worked hard in the Lord. Greet Rufus, chosen to the Lord, also his mother, who has been a mother to me as well. Greet Asyncritus, Phlegon, Hermes, Patrobus, Hermas, and the brothers who are with them. Greet Philologus, Julia, Nereus, and his sister, and Olympus, and all the saints who are with them. Greet one another with a holy kiss. All the churches of Christ greet you." Yep. So CC says Paul's letter to the Romans is possibly written before Peter ever visited Rome. That's why it's usually not referenced. Yeah, that's right. And I do agree with that. But I think it does point to some important pictures. And I'll mainly be discussing this in the last part with regards to Roman ecclesiology, because I think the idea that there were presumably valid churches in Rome before Peter arrives, but then suddenly an episcopate is only then established, and that must have presumably gone over the heads of the leadership already in Rome. I think that gives some very weird, at minimum weird, if not problematic conclusions if we assume Roman categories were there at the very beginning. But that's another topic. There's some other stuff that can be found here as well. So, as I said, the letter to the Romans is oft overlooked data in this issue, particularly chapter 16. It does give regards to Paul gives regards to numerous significant figures and even multiple congregations, one referred to explicitly as a church in the house of Aquila and Priscilla. So, ten katoikon auton ecclesian. So, literally, the according to their house church. So, the church at their house. And so these congregations are the house church of Aquila and Priscilla, verses 3-5. The brothers who are with Asyncritus, Phlegon, Hermes, Patrobus, and Hermas, that's in verse 14. And the saints with Philologus, Julia, Nereus, plus his sister, and Olympus. So at minimum, 3 distinct congregations here. Now, there may also be other congregations who are of Aristobulus and of Narcissus, i.e. their households, though it's not fully clear whether they're distinct congregations or simply prominent Christian families. But it's very possible, though, because, again, as we see, there is literally a church in the house of Aquila and Priscilla. So it's very possible. Otherwise, Peter Lamp lists all 5 examples as congregations, whereas I'm being a bit more modest and just saying 3 of them were most certainly congregations. Anyway, so this concurs with the archaeological data we have in the parallel existence of numerous congregations in Rome, and attests to congregations and likely their leaders as well. Numerous leaders required by practical necessity, of course. Does not address the Rome as the church singular, which makes sense given the multiplicity of worship centers. And of course, again, don't say, oh, but Paul doesn't address the Philippians, or it doesn't address other ones. It's just the church. Chill out. I know I'm not saying anything. I'm not giving conclusions just yet. Chill out. But yeah, this is explained why Paul wouldn't call them the church singular, because he himself quite explicitly recognized there's multiple churches in Rome, just by the mere fact that he calls those with Priscilla and Aquila a church. So yeah, this actually explains why Paul wouldn't call it the church singular at Rome. Not that category would necessarily be bad. Priscilla and Aquila, Mathema pastors, based Priscilla working with the widows and the elderly and children, based woman ministry. Oh man, I agree. I very much agree. It's already been the case, but anyway. Now, easily one of my favorite sources on this topic, and just one of my favorite sources in general, First Clement, or simply just the letter of Clement to the Corinthian Christians. So this is definitely our earliest source from the Roman leadership, and arguably the most important patristic source we have with respect to antiquity. So again, often considered dating to the 90s, AD 90s during their persecution, because, and I believe this is primarily based upon Eusebius's chronology, where he puts Clement at the time of Domitian in the 90s. But of course, as many people recognize, Eusebius is not exactly perfect with his chronology, to be nice. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily given. But I'm not just saying, oh, Eusebius bad, therefore he wrong with this for no good reason. Remember what I said at the beginning. We trust sources unless given good reason otherwise. I've researched somewhat of his alleged chronological errors before, and there is actually a fair point by people that he does make errors, not necessarily himself, but maybe simply his sources. But this does allow us to give pause on his chronological claims, but not just to outright reject them because he makes an error somewhere else. But nonetheless, I do believe we have positive evidence for why First Clement was not written in the 90s. And so I'll summarize the key reasons here, but I won't go to a crazy depth because I've already done a whole presentation where this was a big chunk of it. My First Clement ecclesiology presentation. Please go look at that when you've got time. It is big stuff. It was another big presentation I did. But to summarize the key evidences here, really the key evidence plus some other things that support it. He refers to the Jewish temple sacrifices as a present reality in chapter 41. That's like the key center point evidence, and it is hugely significant, massively significant. Because it's very firmly established that the temple was destroyed in AD 70. And so if Clement's talking about this stuff still happening, this is at a maximum being written or has been written in the year 70, just before destruction, if not likely before the year 70, which is huge, absolutely huge. Written before, depending on your opinions on it, written before multiple books of the New Testament. That's insane to think about. Really, really insane to think about. And so that really is the key evidence. And I address certain objections, mainly the argument from J.B. Lightfoot, where he says, oh, Clement's just using the historic present, which actually doesn't make sense in the context. I gave my arguments on that. Again, check out the First Clement presentation. It's good stuff. Now, we also see in chapter 5, when Clement turns his readers' attentions to examples of holy men who suffered for the faith, and that these holy men, quote, live nearest hengista, superlative. So a basic adjective, you have good, that's just a basic adjective. Comparative adjective, better, so it's literally gooder than another thing you're referencing, and then best, so the highest form of that quality of the objective. And so that's what angista here, literally the nearest superlative to our time, and that belong to their own generation. Tes geneas hemon. And the two explicit figures he refers to after mentioning that these figures belong to their own generation are Peter and Paul, who died in the 60s, were martyred in the 60s. So now, Definitely possible. Definitely possible. Clement could have easily lived in the 90s. John lived into the 100s. Or up to 100 at least. But it does not make a whole lot of sense to say our generation in the 90s, when at that point they're all going to be, the people of his generation are going to be a bunch of geriatrics compared to comparatively a lot more middle-aged to younger people. So there is a little bit of a tension of this being written in the 90s on the count of this, whereas it fits like a glove in the 70s. Easy, fits like a glove. Now, the last piece of evidence is that he greets a certain Fortunatus, and the fact that he greets Fortunatus as one name versus the other two figures where he gives a fuller name, two names. The single name implies that this is a well-known individual, and sure enough, Paul himself refers to a Fortunatus in Corinth in his first letter to Corinthians. And so, again, more likely if this Fortunatus guy is still around in the 70s than in the 90s. We don't know how old he was, so is it technically possible that Fortunatus lived in the 90s? Sure, let's grant that. But definitely more likely in the 70s. So all this combined is very, very conclusive that Clement was in the 70s, in my humble opinion. Again, watch the presentation that I did on First Clement. And now next. So now let's go to authorship, because this is actually another one of my big little personal things that I came to that I think is a unique contribution as well. Regarding the plural authorship of First Clement, I discussed this a little bit in my Clement stream, but now I'm actually going to go into more detail on the case for that on over here. So ironically, the Clement stream has a little bit less on this than I have on here, even though this is not specifically focused on Clement. And I'm focusing on a lot now because there's been because I did receive some objections to this, mainly from Swan Sonna, particularly when I asked it of him in his stream. I think it was his case for the Monopiscopacy stream on Reason and Theology. I gave this objection to say on it, and he gave another example. I'll raise it up later. Point being, I have a good interest in establishing the authorship of Clement and demonstrating that the evidence shows that it was of plural authorship, because I believe that has some big implications. So, authorship is commonly assumed to be Clement of Rome, and this is half true. I believe the evidence can establish that half, but the letter itself and the two earliest authorial attestations very likely refer to collective authorship of the Roman ecclesial leaders. So, first thing to look at is the prologue of the letter itself. So, it first says, the church of God that sojourns in Rome, to the church of God that sojourns in Corinth. And again, sorry if it's blue, if people can't really see it well, but the blue does say, to the church of God that sojourns in Corinth. And I linked them up with the relevant Greek. So, the he ecclesia tu theo he paroikousa Romain, so the church of God, the resider in Rome. And then te ecclesiae tu theou te paroikouse Corinthon, so the church of God that resides in Corinth. Now, so what? Why is this important? Because this is a standard epistolary opening where the recipient names himself, and then the author names himself, and then he names the recipient, and particular with the dative sense to literally say this guy to this guy. And you can see this a lot in Paul's own letters, for example, ubiquitously, and in many other ecclesial letters throughout church history and non-Christian letters as well. This is a very standard opening. The author names himself and then names the recipient immediately after with the dative tense in order to say to this person. So this is important because what this shows is that the letter explicitly states its authorship as the church in Rome. Get the gears spinning in your head. I think you can see where I'm going with this. So, to further demonstrate this is that we can look at the nature of the recipient by looking at how they're described in the letter. So the recipient is equivalent. The recipient is equivalent strongly with the author themselves. So the church at Rome, the church at Corinth. There's a conceptual distinction, just two different instances: one church in Corinth, one church in Rome. And so it can be helpful to establish who they meant specifically as the church in Corinth. And so the letter explicitly addresses numerous individuals at Corinth, chiefly those involved in the schism. So it says, they say in chapter 52:1, The master, brothers, and that's an address, O brothers, has no need of anything. So adelphoi. And then in 53, next chapter, 53, verse 1, for you know, epistaste, a plural second person verb, you know well the sacred scriptures, dear friends, agapetoi, beloved, plural. And then in chapter 54, verse 1, this is very interesting. Now then, who, this, singular, among you, and humin, plural, is noble. And then you, humis, plural, therefore, who laid the foundation of the revolt, must submit to the presbyters and accept discipline leading to repentance, bending the knees of your heart. So, this combined with, which was my main thing that I sent to Swan Sonner, which he objected to. So this combined with the ubiquitous use, the absolute use of the first person plural by the authors throughout First Clement, and then combined with the literal authorship of the Church in Rome, this therefore almost certainly refers to the collective leadership of the city as the authors of this. It's very, very clear, very, very obvious now that we see this evidence. So it's three things combined. The fact that the church in Corinth is a plurality of individuals, the fact that the authors explicitly use the first person plural every time throughout the letter, and that the author is given as the church in Rome, not Clement, not Bob, but the church at Rome. Now, now we look at the two earliest authorial attestations of the letter. So it's very likely confirmed, the plural authorship, very likely confirmed by these two earliest attestations. So the first one I want to look at is Irenaeus in his Against Heresies, book 3, chapter 3. He says, in the time of this Clement, no small dissension having occurred among the brethren at Corinth, the church in Rome dispatched a most powerful letter to the Corinthians. Notice that. He mentions Clement. At the time of this Clement, the church at Rome dispatched a letter to the Corinthians. Now, this is important. So clearly, if Irenaeus wanted to say Clement is the author, properly speaking, of the letter, he could very easily, this is one of the few areas where you can give a would that makes sense. I say that he would say, in the time of this Clement, he dispatched the most powerful letter to Corinthians. But he doesn't. Irenaeus switches the subject entirely to the church in Rome, and that they dispatched a most powerful letter to the Corinthians. And now, of course, the church, it's a collective singular noun. But point being, he does a different subject altogether. And contextually, this would be in reference to plural, multiple leaders who dispatched this. Good old-fashioned debates in the comments section on, let's see, the United Nations, on Pachamama, and on universalism. How good. Oh, boy, I love my comment sections. So yeah, and it seems quite likely that Irenaeus may simply just be going off the letter itself. He recognized that the letter is, names its author as the church in Rome, and that this is distinct from Clement. But Irenaeus highlights that this is in the time of Clement. And so it's clear, Irenaeus does seem to assume that the church as a collective dispatched the letter of the Romans to the Corinthians. Now, the second attestation, not very well known, is from Dionysius of Corinth in the late 2nd century, around the same time as, actually either slightly before or at the same time as Irenaeus. And this is a fragment preserved in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, book 4, chapter 23. But I'm using this because it's a fragment of a 2nd century source. So I will occasionally use Eusebius because he preserves sources from the time period that I'm restricting myself to. And so Dionysius of Corinth, he says so Eusebius says this is a letter dispatched to the church of Rome, to Soter specifically. But here's what the letter itself actually says in a fragment he preserves. So Dionysius says, today we have passed the Lord's holy day in which we have read your humon, plural, epistle. From it, whenever we read it, we shall always be able to draw advice, as also from the former epistle, which was written to us through Clement. How interesting. How very interesting is that? Very interesting. Very, very interesting. So, obviously, the Church of Rome, they dispatched a certain letter later on to the Corinthians. but then they're likening it, they're reading it regularly and likening it to another letter written before through Clement. Notice this attestation isn't as strong, but it does give a good hint. It's not saying that this is from Clement, this letter, but written to us through Clement. Clement is instrumental. And I forgot to fix the slide for this because I made an error. I thought that the your letter, Humon letter, was the same one as the letter written through Clement, but actually when you read here, it does say, from it, whenever we read it, we shall always be able to draw advice, as also from the former epistle, which was written to us through Clement. So there's actually two distinct letters here. But nonetheless, this actually does show that the collective Roman authorship sent letters twice. So first Clement, and then another later letter to the church at Corinth, which is explicitly said by Dionysius to be of you, plural, humon. But the former letter was written to us through Clement. And so not as explicit. One could potentially simply say, well, by through Clement, Dionysius did mean it was actually authored properly by Clement. Possible, but it makes better sense in terms of why he specifically used dia Clementos, which is through. It's quite an instrumental preposition, that it was written to us through Clement. And it makes better sense that Dionysius assumes what Irenaeus assumes, and likewise sees what's in the letter itself, that it was written by the collective church. And so we have another second, not as crazy strong, but otherwise a second authorial attestation to the plural collective authorship of First Clement. But yeah, again, I forgot to change the slide because there's two different letters mentioned here, not the same one. But nonetheless, it is evidence for the plural authorship of First Clement as well. So what else I say here? Your plural letter written through Clement. So yeah, again, that was an error. I was supposed to change that. Forgot to. I was very rushed. Strong evidence for Clement as instrumental but not direct author of the letter, i.e. a scribe. So I will say this nonetheless. So through Clement makes sense as either some kind of scribe or a foreign correspondent, main representative, or perhaps both. So these attestations, the evidence from the letter itself, the witness of Irenaeus and the witness of Dionysius, makes perfect sense to see Clement not as the author, properly speaking, but as the scribe and or a foreign correspondent. And now I'll also say as well, somewhat contra Eusebius, that because he does say that the letter of Dionysius to Rome was specifically to Soter. So he says to Rome, but addressed to Soter. But I believe that his own fragments show that it was primarily to the church of Rome, not specifically to Soter, because in a prior fragment, the letter of Dionysius mentions your, plural, blessed bishop Soter, homakarios humon episcopos Soter. So addressing Soter as a third person, and the you is the collective recipients of the letter at Rome. And so that makes perfect sense of authorship. And now, so given this evidence, again, what you do, get rid of prior presuppositions, looking at the evidence diachronically from the earliest to the latest, we clearly see that with the earliest evidence from both First Clement itself and its earliest witnesses, that it was very, very, very likely of plural authorship. Now, there's some objections to this, because as I said, I sent these objections to Swansona in a Q&A of his stream on Reason and Theology for their case for them on Episcopacy. Do tell us, by the way, people in the comments, if you're enjoying this so far, if you're learning a bunch from it, give it a like, subscribe, share it to everybody you think it will be edified, and consider supporting my ministry. Link down below. Anyway, I sent, guys, come on, why are you guys always arguing about the flipping in the comments, the Pachamama, Muslim worship, blah, 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 blah. Can you guys, come on, seriously, this is somewhat distracting me now, and I've been doing a good job so far, not being distracted by the chat, but guys, come on, try to talk about what's being discussed here. If you guys argue about that, I'm cool, but if you're arguing about my Pachamama and all that stuff, oh my word, all right. Anyway, please, I insist, people. Thank you, E5. Thank you very much. Now, anyway, I sent this objection to Swansona, and he gave a significant objection to it. So he says that we cannot rule out the use of a royal we. So that is an individual author using the first person plural in representation of a collective. So there's still fundamentally one author, but they represent a collective. They emphasize their royal greater power, but nonetheless, they're still a single author. And the key example of this that Swan brings up, and it's a smart one because Roman Catholics would traditionally consider First Clement as like the first papal encyclical, maybe apart from First and Second Peter. But either way, he whatchamacallit. So they'll consider that, and so they do consider, Swan does consider Clement as like the author proper. So then he raises another example of a papal encyclical, Munificentissimus Deus, which dogmatized the Assumption of Mary, and that encyclical exclusively uses the first person plural, and yet there's clearly a singular author, Pope Pius XII. Whatchamacallit. Okay. Wait, Liam Pender, good to see you, buddy. Good to see you. Clement had no authority. His position does. That's semantics. Okay. When we're saying that this person had authority, we are obviously meaning in the context of their office. This is semantics. If he addressed the letter as from Clement, it would be a personal letter, but addressing it from the Church of Rome means Clement speaking for the church. Not true, as I'll demonstrate just here. Well, for one, there's multiple episcopal letters in official capacity that are addressed in that mention the single author themselves. I'm not simply saying, me, and all that stuff, but just simply mentioning, hey, this is who it's from, me, the author, the singular. So, no, this is importing later categories in. I'm going to demonstrate more on this why. Anyway, so my first response is that the first person plural ought by default be considered actual unless the context determines otherwise. The royal we is not common and is an exceptional literary type of use of we. And as I've seen, no primary source evidence prefers or implies a singular author, notwithstanding a scribe or correspondent within the letter or the two earliest attestations of authorship. Again, best evidence would be through Clement. The letter is sent through Clement, but that doesn't even necessarily or even prefer a single author in the sense of who composed what was put into the letter. It's very easily read as Clement as an instrument of the letter, whether by being a scribe or a foreign, a foreign dignitary, or both. Anyway, so response number 2, not just use of the first person plural, but the direct naming of the author, as in the church in Rome, which combined with we and the address to the church in Corinth clearly being multiple persons, requires us to take the church of Rome as the collective leadership. Okay, Liam, you're making a distinction between the church of a whole and the leader of the church, which people in the first century never would have made. Well, yes, they would. In terms of just a basic conceptual distinction, there's the church, the whole church, and then there's an individual, even granting their office, the person. I'm not trying to draw a hard distinction between the leader, the representative, and the church themselves. I recognize, obviously, there is strong conceptual overlap, even in terms of representation. It can maybe said, especially primarily in monepiscopal contexts, that the bishop is the church in this sense. But again, you're importing these categories, not me. I'm simply looking at the evidence as it is, and the evidence as it is suggests a plural authorship. It makes sense of what's in the letter. You have to assume a monepiscopal model, read that into this text in order to make this distinction. My position is simpler, makes better account of the evidence. That's all I'm saying here. And this is going to be further evidence later on the idea of, they're one guy being the church, so therefore the church here could simply be the singular guy. As I'll show the later evidence, it's very clear that Rome's supreme leadership was plural. But yes, anyway, so that, so here's the thing. So not just that the first person plural is used, the we, because that was the main thing that Swanson objected to, that I just appealed to the use of we, and that's all he responded to. But in my question, I explicitly also appealed to the fact that the author of the letter is the Church of Rome. And that's what I key appeal to, because the normative way of these letters sent by episcopal leaders, even in the capacity of representation, is by addressing themselves. I'm sending this to you or you guys, as we see with Paul's letters, for example. Paul's own letter from where he was, Paul's own letters, for example, even if they are in representation of other churches and other individuals helping him out. Anyway, we do know well versed in philosophy. Isn't Rome still a plural episcopacy? I've been trying, Paul, but they keep drowning me. I'm getting your comments, bro. Don't worry. I'm getting your comments. But join the Discord. That is a good place to hash this out. But do keep giving your comments anyway if you want. You give questions even as well. And God willing, if I can get to it, then yeah, there you go. But yeah, point being, it does become the norm in monepiscopal contexts for letters to say, hey, it's this guy, this bishop guy to these guys here. Or in some other way, it's clear that there was a single guy behind the letter. But point being, we see in the very prologue, the very opening of First Clement, that's the Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth. And again, there's something else you missed out, Liam. As I mentioned in the other part of the stream, the church in Corinth is clearly intended as multiple individuals, as from the letter itself. And so that, combined with the equivalent title, the church in Rome, combined with the use in we, prefers us, therefore, to assume that there's multiple authors behind this. If you want to argue that there was one principal author, but he acted in these other specific monepiscopal conceptions of the bishop as being the true representative of the whole church and speaking on behalf of the whole church, you can do that, but that's not from the evidence. You have to import those foreign categories. Anyway, I hope that's the biggest distraction I have now. Not that you're a distraction, Liam. Those are good responses, but I think they miss out on a few things. And the final response, the most key response to Swan's criticism, is that Munificentissimus Deus names Pope Pius XII as the singular author, not the church that sojourns in Rome. So that alone just annihilates the comparison right there. Sure, the royal we is used in Munificentissimus Deus. That's great. If that's all I was appealing to in Clement, then and otherwise the letter said from Clement to the church at Corinth or to this and that and all that stuff, granted, that would be a stretch. That'd be an assumption. But it's not, because I'm using the plural we and the fact that it's the church at Rome and the fact that the church at Corinth is clearly numerous individuals in order to say that there is a plural authorship behind the letters. And by the way, this isn't me saying that therefore there was no highest leader who could in some context be said to represent the church of Rome. That's not what I'm saying at all, because an archiepiscopal model could very much mean that. I'm simply saying that those behind the letter, there was clearly more than one person behind the letter. That's all I'm saying. It's actually very modest, but I think combined with other evidence does cause questions against the monepiscopacy. Anyway, moving on. Authorship conclusions. I believe there's some clear implications of the authorship. It demonstrates the... anyway, that's my response to Swan. Hope he gets it. So what this demonstrates, given that there were numerous leaders behind the authorship of First Clement, this demonstrates that Rome's leadership at the time was fundamentally collegial in nature, particularly in interactions, specifically here in interactions with foreign jurisdictions, which is very important because that would eventually primarily become the role of the monepiscopal bishop, particularly, for example, in the context of ecumenical councils. For example, the bishop plus maybe a couple of priests, acolytes, and all that would attend the council and represent their church there. Or in, again, ecclesial controversies, it'd be this bishop sends a letter to this bishop sends a letter to that bishop. But here we have the plural leadership of Rome addressing a controversy in Corinth, but collectively, not simply one dude, but their collective leadership pulls in their takes, their decisions, what they want to say into a letter to another city. Very significant, very, very significant, especially if you want to assert that that the Clement demonstrates Roman supremacy because they're weighing in on something in a foreign city. That would kind of backfire. But anyway. Thank you, Josh. Thank you very much. Scholarly consensus is First Clement had one. Most scholarly consensus. Most scholars say that. Most scholars. I'm sorry, bro. I'm sorry. But hey, look. Now, here's the thing. For one, scholarly consensus, do not care. Facts is all I care about. That's why I barely cite any scholars in this, by the way, because not that I haven't used them. Again, I'll release my full bibliography sometime after this. I use plenty of scholarship, but it's not simply because most scholar says this. Fundamentally appealing to facts and good reason from that. But yes, anyway. Hey, Dr. Bob, good evening, man. Good to see you here. Good to see you here. Now, anyway, scholarly consensus is that one Clement had one author. Now, here's the thing. This is where I distinguish. In what sense do we mean author? If we mean author as in those who compose the letter in the sense of they chose what's going to be said in the letter, what's the content, what's the substance, then I simply say no. I don't believe that's the case. I think the evidence much better prefers the whatchamacallit, the plural authorship. Now, again, to bring back distinctions between compatible data versus evidence, direct contradiction versus indirect contradiction, and all that, I'll say I'm not going to go absolutely insane with my assertions. I'll say it's that the evidence does prefer collective authorship, and I think it makes that relatively clear. But it is possible, nonetheless, that you could import extra assumptions in order to say that there really was one person who put in the substance of the letter. But again, I'd say that now you're going beyond the evidence, and your view is therefore not demonstrated by the evidence, strictly speaking. But in the other sense of author, as in the one who literally scribally wrote down the letter, 100% agree. Makes perfect sense. That's just the norm of how it always happens. Having multiple people write the same letter, like how does that even work? Unless like one guy wrote a letter, something happens to interrupt him, and then another guy continues it off. That's like in a very exceptional circumstance. No reason to think that happened with one Clement. And the letter is one big cohesive whole. So this would necessitate one single effort in order to compose everything. In other words, best explained by a single author. So in that sense, I agree. One author behind First Clement. I'm not like a redaction dude. Oh, here's the C source in Clement, and oh, here's the L source that appeals from this thing. And I'm not one of those cringe liberal theologians. Okay, there is one author, but in the proper sense of author, there's multiple authors. That's what I'm arguing. That's what I demonstrate. Anyway, moving on. First Clement ecclesiology. Now, again, I point people to my First Clement presentation because that's where I make the majority of my case. Just going to close this window quickly. Sun's starting to peek through. And so, yeah, anyway, I point people to my investigation there because that's where I go into the greatest depth. But nonetheless, I'll summarize my conclusions here. It clearly attests to the apostles establishing two fundamental orders, the Episcopacy and the Diaconoi. And that section I already read out before, chapter 42, verses 4 to 5. Read that out earlier. And like the apostolic text, elder is used in multiple senses, such as elderly men earlier on in the letter. But in ecclesial context, it refers identically to the overseers in chapter 44. And I believe I put the quote in the next slide, so we'll see that. And chapter 44 also refers to the appointment of overseers by the apostles and other reputable men in later times with the consent of the whole assembly. I argued, admittedly a potential stretch, but I did argue in the presentation that this showed that it wasn't necessarily other episcopoi who ordained other episcopoi, which would be big, very, very big in terms of development. And then chapter 44 also gives an emphasis on the holiness and good fruits of the overseers in Corinth as reason for the wrongfulness of their removal. And not strictly relevant here, but as I mentioned in that presentation as well, Clement's silence there on the basic fact of sacramental validity and all that, which would just be a slam dunk thing against the Corinthians. I believe the fact that he doesn't mention that at all, and simply that they were good leaders, shows that there wasn't a developed concept of sacramental validity via lineal apostolic succession. I argued that in that presentation. You go take a look there. Not relevant here. Will be in probably the last part. Anyway, so that's the gist of First Clement's ecclesiology. And here the key text here. So chapter 44, which reads, "Our apostles likewise knew through our Lord that there would be strife over the bishop's office, Deus Episcopes," so literally the episcopate. "For this reason, therefore, having received complete foreknowledge, they appointed the leaders mentioned earlier, and afterwards they gave the officers a permanent character. That is, if they should die, other approved men should succeed to their ministry. These, therefore, who were appointed," next image, "by them, or later on by other reputable men, with the consent of the whole church, and who have ministered to the flock of Christ blamelessly, humbly, peaceably, and unselfishly for a long time, have been well spoken of all, by all. These we consider to be unjustly removed from their ministry. For it will be no small sin for us if we depose from the bishop's office, Deus Episcopes, those who have offered the gifts blamelessly and in holiness. Blessed are those presbyteroi, who have gone on ahead, who took their departure at a mature and fruitful age, for they no longer need fear that someone may remove them from their established place. Their hydrumennu autois topu. So, very clear conflative use in ecclesial context of episkopos with presbyteros. That the presbyters were the bishops were the presbyters, back and forth, so on and so forth. Because Clement is addressing the overthrow of leaders, the overthrow of bishops, and then contrasting that with the ideal that those presbyters who haven't been deposed are blessed, they're lucky, they're good. And so very, very clear in reference to the same type, the same group of people, the same type of people, but one set of them got deposed and the ideal set doesn't get opposed. So very clearly, very explicitly the same group. I did see this one paper, like, I don't know if it was early 20th century or mid 20th century or something like that. But that paper did try to argue that there is a distinction, that Clement does make a distinction between the bishop and the presbyter by saying, oh, look, he refers to the bishop's office as the episcopae, but then the presbyter has the place, the topos. And he did some really fantastic gymnastics to say that topos and episcopae are properly distinct things and not simply different words of the same thing in First Clement. And it was truly astonishing. It really was astonishing. Yeah, it's not good. It's not great. But yeah. So point being, very clear in Clement, he's addressing the overthrow of a certain group. What's clear with the context of the entire letter is that the authors are addressing the overthrow of a group, of this one group of leaders. One point called, primarily called the presbyters, the presbyteroi, by Clement, by the authors rather. and so there's no distinction within this group. That Clement doesn't, in the practical discussion, distinguish between this group at all. And so when he's applying principles regarding when he's discussing why Christ and the apostles established the episcopate, and that it's good that you don't overthrow them when they're doing a good job and all that stuff, the only reasonable way to read this is that this is in reference to the same group, just with different terms that emphasize different aspects of who they are. And again, given the formal, given the contextual data we've done through before, this makes perfect sense that the presbyters are the bishops are the presbyters in ecclesial context. So that's some very explicit testimony in First Clement. I forgot to get rid of those square brackets. Now, so very clear in First Clement, and I'm leaving conclusions on each source at the very end. So again, as I mentioned, the very end is when I evaluate the hypotheses in each source and then all together. Now, a little excursus on Ignatius. So not a proper section, but an excursus. 1 second. Sorry, loving this. Is great stuff. But yeah, sorry, Canadian Catholic, thank you again for the super chat. You don't have to keep sending me money, man. Seriously. You're literally paying the dirty prots. For real, bro. For real. Oh, man. And guys, I hope conversations are keeping relevant. Anyway, so Ignatius either directly names or references the sole bishop of local churches in 5 of his 6 epistles to the churches. His 7th epistle is to Polycarp, so that's why I say 6. So in Ephesus, he names Onesimus in chapters 1, 2, and 6. In Magnesia, he names Damas in chapter 2. In Tralia, he names Polybius in chapter 1. And in Philadelphia, he doesn't name him, but the single bishop is strongly implied, if not directly mentioned, in his recounting of his own telling the Philadelphians in their presence to obey their bishop. And so, by clear logical implication, Ignatius assumes that they have a single bishop. And then in Smyrna, he also doesn't name the bishop, but the bishop is directly mentioned in chapter 12. Now, what's interesting here is that, well, not really interesting. I'm going to say why. No bishop is named or mentioned in the letter of Rome. So not only is no one named, but a bishop isn't even mentioned in Rome. Oh, debunked, Ignatius. No, there's no plural bishops in debunked. Woo, boys, let's do it. Problem, the silence is of little to no significance. Yeah. So this is where I diverge from many of my prot friends on this issue, including well-read ones. So it's not unnecessary shade. But contrary to many of them, the silence of Ignatius is a nothing burger. It's a nothing burger straight up. The Romanists are right about this. No quibble about it. Although they still manage to bring in some faulty reasoning about this, and I'll explain why in a sec. But nonetheless, they're right. So there's a very distinct context in Ignatius's letter to Rome. And yes, Matt, thank you so much, Matt Bell, my loyal moderator. That's the Discord. Join us if you want to keep these high intellectual discussions. But yes, the context, the message of his letter to Rome is very distinct to the other letters. So the other letters are general calls for good Christian living and church order in particular. So that's why Ignatius emphasizes submission to the bishops, to the deacons, to the presbyters, and all that stuff in those letters. Whereas in his letter to the Romans, he doesn't really discuss that at all. He's simply telling him specifically, don't hinder my martyrdom. I want to go through with it. I want to become a true disciple of Christ. That's how he considers himself with martyrdom. And so there's no strict reason to say why he would address that. Maybe one could suppose that, Ignatius would likely address the bishop/presbyters in order to tell them, hey, make sure your people don't do that. But not necessarily, because it is very common in the Christian letters to address the whole people and exhort the whole people to do something and not just their leaders. So that doesn't really mean anything at all. Nothing, because he also doesn't mention presbyters or deacons at all in the letter to the Romans, unlike the other letters. And so some of the faulty. So the Ignatius thing, total non-witness in this issue, doesn't really help us at all. Now, that being said, the silence is often explained by a desire to not expose the Roman leadership the Christian Roman leadership to persecution. This is the explanation often given by the Roman apologists, and I'm not against it in principle, but the fact that Ignatius himself is arrested and being hauled through Asia Minor while sending letters filled with names to the churches around them calls that into question. At minimum, calls that into question. Maybe Rome, the city of Rome, was a particular hotbed, but I don't think so. The fact that Ignatius is being hauled off calls that into question. I think it's more likely that he may simply just not know people from the Roman church at all. So that's why he doesn't name anybody, doesn't mention anything about them. So this leaves open this Ignatius leaves wide open the question of the nature of the Roman episcopate at his own time. Now, with that being said, there is some Romanists who do like to turn Ignatius into positive evidence from monepiscopacy in Rome. I'm kind of cheating on my own standards here when I say clear your mind of presuppositions and all that stuff, but I thought it'd be good to address this here in this excursus. It's not in the main thing, but it is claimed by certain Roman thinkers, particularly Joe Heschmeyer, that Ignatius considers the three-tier hierarchy with monepiscopacy essential to a church, and thus would have been known or assumed Rome to be monepiscopal. So either known or assumed Rome to be monepiscopal. Again, assumes there's the assumption that Ignatius is monepiscopal versus archiepiscopal. Yes, even though he calls one the bishop, it assumes that he's fundamentally distinct from the presbyters rather than the highest of the presbyters, and the authority is otherwise collectively with them. That's an assumption, not demonstrated, but that'll be another analysis. I'm not dealing with it here because Ignatius doesn't really deal with Rome. But nonetheless, this argument does try to say, he tries to say that because Ignatius considers this evidence, the three-tier hierarchy, essential, that therefore, Matt Bell, you're totally correct. Guys, if you're arguing about something irrelevant, just take it to the Discord. Just do it there. There's the Big Brain Discourse section. Let's keep this discussion for the stream and your questions as well. But yeah, you can argue about Vatican I on the Discord. So he tries to say that the three-tier hierarchy, according to Ignatius, is essential to the church and therefore would have known or assumed Rome to be monepiscopal. And this is inferred from chapter 3 of his letter to the Trallians, where he says, similarly, let everybody respect the deacons as Jesus Christ, just as they should respect the bishop, who is a model of the Father, and the presbyters as God's council and as the band of the apostles. Without these, choris touton, no group can be called a church. And so they argue that, hey, look, Ignatius says without these three tiers, submission to these three tiers, you don't have a true church. Therefore, Ignatius must know or assume Rome to be monepiscopal. The obvious problem, however, not super obvious, but the problem, however, is context. The context much prefers, because this is what Ignatius is talking about, that he is contrasting clinging to your orthodox hierarchy as opposed to running off with false teachers who are, schismatics by the mere fact that they're teaching false teaching. And you can see that in chapters 6 and 7 of Letter to the Trallians. And so Ignatius' dialectic here is asserting the practical matter, is exhorting the Trallians on a practical matter with the assumption of a three-tier hierarchy, not asserting a three-tier hierarchy, but assuming a three-tier hierarchy. And again, whether it's a true three-tier hierarchy as per a monarchic episcopate versus presbyters and deacons, but then with one presbyter above the others, that's a different discussion altogether. That's not a granted. But even assuming that's the case, Ignatius is exhorting order over chaos given the current structure, not commanding one structure and condemning others. That's the key difference. Very, very key difference. He's assuming his structure as the norm for where he's sending the letter to the Trallians, and then saying, stick with them, don't go with the false teachers. He's not condemning other structures. He's not saying this is the only possible structure of the church, and if your church is not the structure, it's not a true church. That's very eisegetical and does not flow with Ignatius' argument throughout the letter to the Trallians at all. And so this is a very, very eisegetical argument by Joe Heschmeyer and others. I'd like a reference with that. Did Linus do or say something that showed he was a pope? He lived decades before Clement. I wouldn't say decades. I don't know. It depends on chronology. I haven't heard anything about Linus. So, haven't seen anything, not from 1st and 2nd century sources at least. Well, apart from Irenaeus just mentioning Linus, but that's it. But yeah. Anyway, so that argument from Ignatius nullified, and so Ignatius is not helpful on this topic. And so we move on. Source number 3, the Shepherd of Hermas. This one's very significant. And given the study I did on this one, it's not as appreciated as it should be because it is very significant, very, very significant. Now, so this was written sometime post 140, according to the Muratorian fragment, which places the writing of the shepherd during the Episcopacy of Pius in Rome, said to be Hermas's brother. And I will address that source after this. It's huge. It's massive. Vision 3.5.1 lists the key roles that establish the tower, which is the church, according to 3.3.3. It's very allegorical, this entire work. And this section reads, now hear about the stones that go into the building. The stones that are square and white and fit all their joints. These are the bishops, episcopi, the teachers, didaskaloi, and the deacons, diakonoi, who have walked according to the holiness of God and have ministered to the elect of God as bishops, teachers, and deacons with purity and reverence. Some have fallen asleep while others are still living. Now, this is very interesting. Excuse me, because apart from Ignatius, the Shepherd of Hermas is actually among our earliest references to 3 offices, but not quite the same as normally put. The 3 offices are the overseer, the teacher, and the deacon. And so this is very, very curious because, as I'm going to show further, whereas we see the plural episkopos presbyteros, the bishop presbyter, split off and one of them becomes the monarch and the others become lesser presbyters, this is just taking the bishops and then there's the teachers. Very interesting. Very, very. So it's kind of a different kind of 3-tier than we normally see. The nature of the teacher as opposed to the overseer is not really clear. It's not really explicated throughout the Shepherd of Hermas, apart from simply how the role of the bishop, I should have given the references, but the role of the bishop, some functions of the bishop are given the shepherd, where it mentions overseers who take in the widows and care and the orphans and care for them and all that stuff. But yeah, apart from that, there's not a whole ton said, and nothing else really said about teachers in the church. So and made worse given that the overseer, in the contextual data, the overseer had a teaching role as well. So to give some reasonable speculation, the teacher office may be akin to just a literal teacher of antiquity and teachers today, where they teach, they expound doctrine and truth, but they don't have a direct juridical authority. I think it's pretty reasonable. We can assume that, but of course that is a bit speculative, so I'm not going to rely on anything on that. Now, the first area of big interest comes in Vision 2. Now, don't forget, this is stuff being addressed to the Roman Church. Okay, this is being addressed to the Roman eldership. Vision 2.4.3 mentions the elders, presbyteron, plural, who preside over, proistamenon, literally are set before the church. Now, given the conflation of elders and overseers in prior proximate Christian sources and the explicit authority of these elders, they are almost certainly the overseers, almost certainly the same group. Unless you want to posit that the teachers also are presiding over the church, but then you'd have to say that the teachers also have like some kind of a supreme authority of the church. With monopiscal model doesn't really work. I'm going to save that to the end though. Save that to the end. So yeah, it makes best sense given the categories already established by our prior sources that these elders are thus the overseers who preside because they preside over proistamenon, set before the church at Rome. Now, after this, the same passage mentions two other figures, a Clement, who will send the little book mentioned here to other cities, and Grapte, who will instruct the widows and the orphans. Now, a note here, some people like to conflate this, but this is a bit of an issue. Oh, my word. What's these arguments happening here? Adam, Canadian Catholic, and whoever else is engaged in this argument that's not regarding the stream topic, please move it to the Discord so that people can chat about and send questions regarding this stream, because I do want to address free questions as well. And the longer the chat gets with arguments that aren't relevant to the stream, the harder it is to find other questions. So please move the argument to the Discord if you haven't already. Anyway, Matt, if they are insistent, if you're still here, Matt, you have the power to give timeouts. Use it if they ignore this. Anyway, so common myth, but given these time periods established for Hermas and First Clement, the Clement mentioned here is almost certainly not the Clement of Rome, but it is an interesting coincidence that this Clement possesses the same foreign correspondent role that I previously hypothesized for Clement before. Thank you very much, Matt. I am no problems. Good stuff. So yeah, it's almost definitely not the same Clement, but it's a nice coincidence. But Clement, it was a common name, so not the greatest coincidence. Anyway, what this does show is that there was a division of labor among the leadership of Rome. That's common sense, human nature, practical necessity. So whether this Clement was among the elders is not entirely clear. But since we do see that elders, if I'm right about Clement being the foreign correspondent guy sending the letter to Corinth, and he was also an elder, so Clement of Rome, and if this holds up as well for other later bishops of Rome who are shown to have interaction with the other cities, then it may well that this Clement is actually another elder among the eldership. And if that's the case, this is a bishop, quote unquote, of Rome who's not in the main succession, and that'd be very significant. The succession of later lists, that is. But anyway, that's speculation. Yeah. So it's unclear for him, but Grapte, since she's likely a woman, would not be among the elders. 1 Timothy 2:12 moment. Now, Vision 3.9.7 is very interesting now as well. So this is part of the warning of the personified church that is in the vision to Hermas. So the church is taking up like a feminine persona in this vision to Hermas. And this is a part of a warning and condemnation that Hermas is to give to the church at Rome. And this is what it says. Now, therefore, I say to you who lead the church, proegumenus theis ecclesias, the prohegemon, like that word hegemon, hegemony. So the prohegemon, the etymological fallacy, but the leading before ones, just to do some silly etymological games. So you who lead the church and occupy the seats of honor, protocathedritais, literally one who sits on the first or chief seat in the plural. Let's keep going. Do not be like the sorcerers, for the sorcerers carry their drugs in bottles, but you carry your drug and poison in your heart. So notice this. It's references to those, plural, who lead the church And this is clearly connected, of course, with the prior vision of the elders who preside over the church. Now, this is important. Look at this. Protocathedrites, literally one who occupies the first seat. The object version is protocathedria, the first seat. And this is a very rare word outside of the Gospels, because the Gospels does reference it to the scribes and the Pharisees who desire the chief seats in the synagogues. But it is synonymous with the much more common proedria, also first seat, which denotes a place of honor or authority. It's used, for example, those who sit at the best seats, the front seats at the theater or in the games. But also in Aristotle's Politics, for example, refers to the best citizens in a democracy, in that those best citizens in a democracy, they hold the proedria, the first seat. And so it does have a clear use within the semantic range to denote authority. So what could be quite deduced here is that given that this is attached with, don't forget, this is a participle. The prior one of you who lead the church, prolegomenos, this is a participle. And so it's somewhat of like a nounish adjectival. It's used in a substantive way. So an adjective used as a substantive is to denote I say subject, but in this case, the indirect object. But either way, it's denoting people, you who lead the church, and directly connected, kai, with the direct, with the conjunction kai, you who occupy the seats of honor. So these two things are very clearly connected in some way. And so I believe it's very clear that the protocathedrites, or the protocathedria, or rather protocathedriae, plural, that these elders occupy, denotes their general position of teaching or judicial authority, or perhaps also the literal front seats of an assembly, where they meet up, and that may be a seat of honor. It's kind of like it's pretty much like the seat of Moses issue when it says the scribes and Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses, whether it's purely their abstract authority or the literal seat in a synagogue, or it likely may refer to both. So yeah, this may well what's happening here as well. Makes best sense given its clear linking with their leadership over the church, that these first seats that they sit, those who sit in the first seats, denotes their authority over the church. And now, and I'm going to leave this in conclusion, but I think I can see people may be able to see where I'm going to go with this one. Now, number 4, we have the Muratorian fragment itself. And this is the main synchronism we have, which anchors the dating of the Shepherd of Hermas in the 2nd century. But the fragment itself likely written sometime post 150 to 170, given its reference to the close proximity. So the actual text itself says, "But Hermas wrote the shepherd very recently in our times in the city of Rome, while Bishop Pius," literally Pio EPS, but the Latin is very much shortened, so it's short for Pio Episcopo, his brother was occupying the chair of the church of the seat of Rome. So literally the Cathedra Urbis Romae Ecclesiae. I'm supposed to do an elision between the nouns, verbs there. And so translational, there's actually a translational ambiguity here. Given that Latin lacks the definite article, the translation of occupying the chair of the church of the city of Rome, it's possible, but not the only possibility. So we're without further context, we're actually not able to determine for certain whether the document is saying that Pius occupies the seat of Rome, singular, or a seat among multiple, again, as explicitly referenced in the Shepherd of Hermas. There's multiple people who sit in the first seats connected to their leadership. And so without additional context, we can't know that. Or additionally, if there's numerous leaders who occupy the one seat, if it's simply one of multiple who occupy the one seat, which is referenced, for example, in the Gospels when Jesus said the scribes and the Pharisees, plural, sit in the seat, singular, of Moses. And then, of course, St. Cyprian himself, I think St. Cyprian does mention later, this is later, admittedly, 3rd century, but it is relevant to establish possibility, does mention that all bishops are descended from Peter. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he used the language that all bishops sit on the seat of Peter. If someone can confirm or disconfirm that for me at some point, that'd be fantastic. But yeah, either way, otherwise it is possible that it's with three possibilities. Either he's the sole occupier of one seat, he's one occupier among others of one seat, or he's occupying one seat among multiple. And the Shepherd of Hermas does very much open the possibility of multiple. But I'll be fair as well. It's not they don't necessarily have the exact same concept in mind. So I kind of leave that one a little bit open, but it would make sense. So either of these are possible. It's kind of up for grabs. Contra Joe Heschmeyer, who says that this is Pius occupying the chair of the seat of Rome, bang, single bishop done. Yeah, not that clear. Not that clear. Or if you want to inject additional assumptions, you could say that he occupies a grand seat above other seats, but that'd be an assumption, a speculation. More water. My word. Okay, number 5, and this is going to be a brief one. Justin Martyr. Among multiple locations, Justin Martyr lived and taught in Rome for a period. His account of the Christian liturgy may thus reflect Roman practice to some degree. He mentions the president, singular, the proestos, who leads the Christian Sunday ceremony, which he details in the first apology. And some like to cite this as evidence of a singular leadership in Rome. It's not a very common argument, thankfully, because it doesn't work. Because it doesn't tell us anything at all about the greater hierarchy of the church, apart from just what happens on the Sunday service. So, yeah, that's it. I included it here anyway, just to get it out of the way. I don't know why I said it's like a whole number 5, because it was a bit of a nothing burger. But just to get that out of the way. Now, here's another interesting one. Hegesippus. We have preserved from his 5-volume memoirs a few fragments from Eusebius, and one of them shows the earliest known bishops list. In particular, this one is connected to Rome, so it's very significant. And so I'm going to say here, the following here is going to be my own translation, because the other ones I had access to for some reason, made what I thought was a big error with how to translate the Diadochein. I haven't gotten the Maya translation yet, which I want to, because that's the latest, and from what I hear, the best translation. So I wasn't able to get that. But either way, this is my translation from the Greek, where Hegesippus says, after coming to Rome, I made a succession, the Diadochein, until Anicetus, whose deacon was Eleutherus, and after Anicetus, Sota succeeded, after whom was Eleutherus. In each succession and in each city was thusly the doctrine, as the law proclaimed, and also the prophets and the Lord. And the Greek literally says it thusly had as the law proclaimed. So Hegesippus is saying, these are the guys, this guy was a bishop here, then this guy, and they all taught the same thing. Fantastic. Orthodoxy confirmed. And yes, Pog, you're right. Justin Martyr does explicitly refer to deacons handing out the Eucharist. Tradcaths debunked. Oh, man. So Hegesippus on succession is very interesting. It's a very hot topic. So the nature of this succession is not fully clear, apart from just saying there's this guy succeeds this guy, so on and so forth. So exactly what it's referring to is not actually very clear. Local Jewish contexts, which would actually be very reasonable to appeal to, because Hegesippus was a Jewish convert, they appeal to succession lines in terms of teaching quite often. So a perfect example is within Tractate Aboth, the very beginning, literally Tractate Fathers, where it mentions how the law came from Moses down to Joshua, down to the prophets, etc., until the Great Sanhedrin. And then also you can see many times in the Talmud itself when it says, this guy said, that this guy said, that this guy said, so on and so forth, going back to a significant leader and saying, hey, this great sage here said this, and then he said it to this guy, and now we got it here. Awesome stuff, fantastic. So, Jewish context of succession, I challenged the idea of them, and I'll probably nuance my position now in one of my responses to Swan Sonna with A Goy for Jesus. I challenged the idea that they had a strict idea of a sacramental validity type of succession, and rather than one primarily based on the teaching content. I did challenge that idea. Maybe they did, maybe not, because I haven't studied it with insane depth. I was just looking at the text in question. But it does appear either way a very strong, the key, the essential types of appeals to succession that the Jews did was to appeal to the chain of custody of teaching. And so this may very likely be, and in fact, Hegesippus does make it clear in this small fragment, that this is the succession he's referring to. He's using a succession of individuals who carried the same teaching from the beginning up until his time. And that's literally what he says in the fragment. His very goal, it says at the very end, in each succession and in each city was the doctrine as the Lord proclaimed, also the prophets and the Lord. And so he's using it to confirm the orthodoxy of these cities. Say, hey, this guy taught this guy taught that, this guy taught that, so on and so forth. And so now, remember prior assumptions and method and all that. Given the prior context in Rome of the clear plurality of leadership, they had numerous supreme leaders over the Roman Church. It may have been possible for Hegesippus to appeal to numerous lines of succession, but that only one was really necessary for his argument. And of course, appealing to multiple individuals at a time would just be a waste of space. I mean, Irenaeus himself explicitly comments about how he doesn't want to use too much space, and so he just appeals to the Roman succession, and that's coming later. Anyway, so exactly what line of teachers he appealed to, and in what metric, in what sense that they were successors, and why he chose them, not actually very clear. It's actually not clear at all. He perhaps did. It's reasonable to assume that he appealed to the most prominent elders / overseers of Rome and their students. But even then, the nature of that prominence is impossible to tell from the fragments. Again, don't just assume, hey, it appeals to one line, therefore they're a supreme bishop who has the sole authority of this church above all the other presbyters. Assumptions. I'll say that's technically possible, but not warranted by the text. It's about assumptions. There's a number of ways this could be taken, and Hegesippus just doesn't make this clear, apart from the fact that he's simply trying to trace the lineage of teaching. And so it's very easy to simply say he just picked one verifiable line of guys and teachers and students, or bishops rather, that this guy came and then this guy came and they all taught the same thing and so on and so forth. And it's particularly relevant because it does mention how he does emphasize that Anicetus was a deacon of Eleutherus, and thus to emphasize, hey, look, they clearly had interaction. They clearly agree. They taught the same doctrine. So yeah, so that's pretty much what we can take from Hegesippus on this issue. Furthermore, he may have specifically appealed. Maybe he chose the successors whom he did because these were the guys who had interaction with foreign churches. And so, for example, Anicetus, in the testimony of Irenaeus, is who met and discussed with Polycarp when Polycarp came to Rome, when he was alive, obviously. And Irenaeus attests this in his letter to Victor. And likewise, Eleutherus in Eusebius's church history was specifically sent a letter from Gaelic Christians and asked him specifically to take care of them. And so Hegesippus may well be appealing to those leaders who had a particular role in foreign correspondence, which would make sense because he's the guys he immediately interacts with, perhaps has the most interaction with, and perhaps also that they simply were the most prominent. Maybe that's why they interacted with other churches the most, because they were considered a chief representative in some respect. That's very much possible. In fact, I personally prefer that explanation in some degree. Again, the nature of that prominence, a whole question in itself. But yeah, that's a reasonable hypothesis, and I'd take it myself. But that being said, the hypothesis that he's appealing specifically to foreign dignitaries is hindered by the fact that Hermas specifically attests to a different Clement, who's not present in any succession list, as the foreign secretary of Rome, and this was at the time of Pius. And so we'd have to say that Pius was somehow also a special foreign interaction guy. Maybe he's the main guy who met people when they came, but then Clement was responsible for sending things out. But that'd be a bunch of speculation. So it does give us pause on that hypothesis. I'd still say nonetheless, it's kind of possible that there are particular people who had interaction outside. And of course, we know the succession lists fallible, so that's entirely possible. Yes, Tato Matamud. I love how to pronounce it. Oh man. Anyway, so that's Hegesippus. Now we get to Irenaeus, the big boy. He's like the center of this discussion very, very often with regards to Rome's succession. We had some cold tea that I didn't finish. And I'm out of water. Great. Hope you guys are all enjoying this. Hope it's fantastic. If you want to make this possible, want to make sure that I can keep doing this, support me and subscribe. So I'll link down below. Any amount. Anyway, so Ignatius he's the big topic of this. So he's probably the earliest source. Let me think over. Yes, I would say so. Yeah, yes. The earliest source that explicitly distinguishes presbyters and overseers. And we can see this most clearly in Book 3, Chapter 14, when he's discussing the very same passage I mentioned as evidence for their conflation. Ironically, Acts chapter 20 in Paul's speech to the presbyter bishops there from Ephesus. When when Irenaeus explicitly says that Paul summoned the bishops and the presbyters from Miletus and other attached cities / regions, because the Latin is civitas, so urbs in Latin, that refers to just the raw city itself, whereas the urbs refers to the city plus its surrounding regions. And so he mentions the bishops and the presbyters. So that's clearly distinct, just like with Ignatius' use, bishops and presbyters, in contrast with the earliest sources that mentions the bishops and the deacons. So very clearly a third class is being mentioned here, that they were summoned from Miletus and from other cities, which makes sense if there is only one bishop per city. That's why Irenaeus would, let's be real, read that into the text, because nowhere does it say or even imply that Paul is summoning people from anywhere other than Miletus. He simply says he's summoning the elders from Miletus. Sorry, from Ephesus. So summoning the elders from Ephesus to meet Paul in Miletus. And So Irenaeus clearly assumes his ecclesiology, and so he has to kind of add that into the text. But either way, nonetheless, this does make it clear that Irenaeus has a distinction between the bishop and the presbyter. Nonetheless, what's very interesting is how commonly, when discussing them, he conflates the terms, nonetheless, chiefly in referring to the bishop as a presbyter. So, even in one instance, calling the presbyters as if they're bishops. So, perfect example. I forgot to include the citation. My apologies, but he mentions the succession of the presbyters. So the presbyters, distinct class, and yet he quotes the LXX, the Septuagint, although granted in the Latin translation, of Isaiah 60. Actually, the same citation that Clement uses, funnily enough, in talking about that we cited earlier, and that mentions, "I will raise your rulers in righteousness, your bishops in righteousness, and your rulers in righteousness, and your bishops in faith." I think that's how the text in Irenaeus went, but it used the term I checked the Latin myself, the episcopus, plural form for that, and so he applied that to the succession of the presbyters, and then yet, of course, the presbyters and the bishops are distinct, and so it's clear to some degree, in some way, that the bishop is still considered a presbyter. In a fundamental sense, he's still a presbyter, but he's also a bishop. And then also, what's very clear as well, very interesting, is that Book 4, Chapter 26, he mentions how the succession of the apostles is possessed by the presbyters, who, together with the succession of the episcopate, pass down the apostolic truth. And so it's up to question exactly how to interpret this. So either he is referring specifically to the bishops, but calls them the presbyters, and so that would explain why he says that these presbyters, together with the episcopate, pass down the doctrine, or he will be referring to presbyters generally, which makes better sense of his use of just presbyter, unqualified, rather than bishop. And so that does make more sense. The succession of the presbyters generally passes along the apostolic truth. And good night, Dr. Bob. I hope you can see the rest of this. Good discussion as always. Thank you very much, Dr. Bob. I hope you will enjoy the rest of this. I hope you enjoyed what you saw already. God bless, mate. And I'll address you in a second, Josh. Thank you again so much for the super chat, man. But yeah, so what's more likely is that he may be referring to the presbyters generally. They pass on they pass on the succession from the apostles together alongside the episcopate. That is what Irenaeus says, Book 4, Chapter 26. You can check it. You can fact check me if you want. But yeah, he otherwise, apart from this, throughout the relevant sections in his book, considers the presbyters, quote unquote, as the preservers of the apostolic tradition. So apart from this, it's actually very unclear the nature of the bishop presbyter distinction in Irenaeus. Apart from just simply saying the bishops and the presbyters pass on the succession from the apostles, that is their teaching, and I'm going to get into that soon. Apart from that, and that there is some kind of distinction between bishops and presbyters, Irenaeus doesn't describe it at all. The nature of this distinction, whether it's a truly authoritative distinction or if it's simply a unique role that the bishop has alongside apart from the presbyters, but the authority is still with the presbyters collectively, and he legitimately says so little. Very, very different. He legitimately says so little. It's there's not really anything you can say about the nature of the bishop as opposed to or over, above, whatever, to the presbyters. Far out. Pog, understandable. My eyes are getting droopy. I'm going to head out as well. Excellent presentation so far. I'm looking forward to finishing this. God bless. Thank you very much, Lan. I'm very happy you like it. I hope everyone else who's going sleepy time will be able to learn from this and be edified. So when Irenaeus is brought up as evidence of monepiscopacy, to mention that again, I know I'm cheating. I'm bringing back categories again. When he's brought up as evidence, this is a perfect example of when people just assume what they know already about the bishop as in contrast to the presbyters from what they already know, and just assume that in Irenaeus when he actually is very unclear as to the nature of the distinction between the presbyter and the bishops. Because Irenaeus, in his Roman list, he is clear that Linus received the episcopate from that Linus. I'm going to get to that Calvin's beard. That Linus receiving the episcopate from Peter and Paul, and then passing that to Clement, and then all that stuff. So they received something specially from the apostles, and yet, of course, at the same time, Irenaeus refers to the successions of the presbyters from the apostles as well, together with the episcopate, and that may hinge on the confusion. May hinge on whether the presbyters there is referring to presbyters generally or just specifically the bishops. In which case, it would be clearing up the confusion. But otherwise, he does clearly mention the presbyters, just presbyters generally, as the preservers and the pastors of apostolic tradition, and that there is some difference there is some distinct office of the episcopate, but otherwise what that is not very clear at all. It's really not. And so as much as I've read on it, I'm not yet still at a conclusion of what it could be. And not entirely sure. It's quite vague. It's quite vague. But nonetheless, I'm not appealing to Irenaeus just because of what he says generally. I'm going to appeal to Irenaeus what he says on the Roman episcopate. Paul is saying episcopate so many times, I'm starting to hear epic biscuit. Oh, my word, bro. Oh, my word. Anyway. Now we have Irenaeus on apostolic succession in Rome. This is the big boy passage that causes all the Romanists to froth at the mouth. And sorry, Josh, I didn't get to your super chat because you send so damn many. It took him to get to Irenaeus to start coping. Oh man, your mum. And what you said before, didn't Irenaeus have a part about Rome being preeminent? And that's where we're at right now. I have anticipated this. This is a relevant evidence because we're talking about Rome here. We're talking about Rome. Now, anyway, so this is actually kind of a distinct topic, the relation of the Church of Rome compared to other churches. That is a different topic to just the nature of the Roman hierarchy specifically, but I will address it anyway, but I'll keep it brief. And I'll leave it to I will leave it to the next part where I talk about the Petrine office and perhaps some Roman supremacy. But anyway, as with Episcopacy, Irenaeus identifies the nature, the significance of the succession with its testimony to receiving authentic apostolic tradition. And so he says, so starting from the top, going down, Since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the successes of all the churches, we do put to confession all those who, in whatever manner, whether by an evil, self-pleasing, by vainglory, or by blindness and perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. We do this by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, very ancient, and universally known church, founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. And given the evidence from Paul's letter to Rome and the dating of it, this is not true that Paul and Peter founded the church at Rome. Perhaps they did do some organization of it after the fact, but they definitely didn't found it. So, not correct. As also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the successions of the bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority. And the Schaeffer edition of New Advent is helpful enough to give the Latin the potiorem principalitatem. And that literally means the greater preeminence. And so it doesn't use the strict Latin word for authority, but it can mean that. But otherwise, the Latin simply literally means the greater preeminence, the greater principality, if you will. And I won't address as much here, but exactly as the nature of that authority, I do think it's clear that it's an intellectual authority. It's very clear that he's emphasizing the fact that they have a rich pedigree of tradition started with Peter and Paul, and they've preserved it up to this day. And so they have a greater authority in the sense of an intellectual authority. So, like, for example, if I talk about Peter Lamp, he is the world-leading authority, or was, I don't know if he's still alive, the world-leading authority on Roman church archaeology. I'm not saying, therefore, he has the right to command me in what I do. He's an intellectual authority in that, in a generic sense, I ought to submit to his opinion on things, at least in a sense, because he's really well read on this, and in comparison, I'm not. And so, in that sense, that's pretty clear in what Irenaeus is saying. That is the sense in which he means that the Roman Church has the greater preeminence because of their greater claim, their richness of their tradition. And so that's clear. But I'm going to leave that mostly to the next stream. But nonetheless, Irenaeus goes on in paragraph 3. The blessed apostles then, having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate. Of this Linus, Paul makes mention in the epistles to Timothy. To him succeeded Anacletus, and after him, in the third place from the apostles, Clement was allotted the bishopric. This man, as he had seen the blessed apostles and had been conversing with them, might be said to have the preaching of the apostles still echoing in his ears, and their traditions before his eyes. Nor was he alone in this, for there were many still remaining who had received instructions from the apostles. That's actually further evidence of the early dating of Clement. The fact that he says Clement heard the apostles, and there were many with his time who heard from the apostles. But anyway, in the time of this Clement, no small dissension having occurred among the brethren at Corinth, the church in Rome dispatched the most powerful letter to the Corinthians, exhorting them to peace, renewing their faith, and declaring the tradition which had lately received from the apostles, proclaiming the one God, omnipotent, the maker of heaven and earth, the creator of man, so on and so on and so forth. From this document, whosoever chooses to do so may learn that he, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, was preached by the churches, and may also understand the apostolic tradition of the church, since the epistle is of older date than these men who are now propagating falsehood, and who conjure into their existence another God beyond the creator and the maker of all existing things. To this Clement there succeeded Evaristus. Alexander followed Evaristus. Then the sixth from the apostles, Sixtus, was appointed. After him, Telephorus, who was gloriously martyred. Then Hyginus after him. Pius, then after him, Anicetus. Soter, having succeeded Anicetus, Eleutherus does now. And the 12th place from the apostles hold the inheritance of the episcopate. In this order and by this succession, the ecclesiastical tradition from the apostles and the preaching of truth have come down to us. And this is most abundant proof that there is one and the same vivifying faith, which has been preserved in the church from the apostles until now and handed down in truth. Now, so it's clear what the purpose of and the nature of the succession to Irenaeus is. It is in a basic sense, a succession of office. That's true. That is true here. But the actual essence of it, why it matters, is the fact of their teaching, the teaching authority that they have. Not the teaching authority, but the fact that they preserve one in the same teaching. So notice Irenaeus doesn't just appeal to, hey, these guys' successors down the apostles, therefore we're right, you're wrong. He gives a specific example of Clement. It spends a good chunk of space on Clement, specifically how he heard the apostles personally, and in his letter, he said this, and that. That agrees with us. And so Irenaeus' approach is not merely, hey, we can establish a line of hands that touched back to the apostles, but rather, here's a line of people who believe the same things all the way up to the apostles, and here's proof. So that's the nature of succession to Irenaeus. Just like Hegesippus, it is fundamentally, primarily, the succession of teaching. And the first paragraph right before this actually makes this clearer. Probably won't read it anymore now because it's just more of what I said, but it just makes it clearer. And my throat is killing me now, so I don't want to say more than I have to. Now, number 8, and this is the last key evidences we'll be going through, the victor question. That is the Quartodeciman controversy. Now, there are sources preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea that date from the 2nd century during the Quartodeciman controversy. So this would be, you can find them in Book 5 of Ecclesiastical History, chapters 23 to 25. Now, they comment on these, Eusebius rather, comments on Victor's actions as well as responses by Irenaeus, Polybius, and other unnamed bishops comments on Victor's actions as well as responses by Irenaeus, Polybius, and other unnamed bishops show... So the comments of Eusebius on Victor's actions as well as the responses by Irenaeus, Polybius, and other unnamed bishops show him attempting to cut off Asia Minor for liturgical practices he disapproved of. And assuming the accuracy of Eusebius's gloss, this appears to be a bit of a power play by Rome on account of what they believed, of course. But most critically, Eusebius does appear to be anachronistic in glosses of some of his documents. I'm talking generally. So see, for example, what I mentioned before about how he said the letter to Rome was addressed specifically, the letter of Dionysius was addressed specifically to Soter, when actually it was addressed to you, plural, in Rome, presumably their plural leadership. And now, likewise here, Eusebius makes mention of the letter of Polycrates as directed to Victor, but Polycrates addresses the recipient in the plural. So take a look at this. I, therefore, brethren, adelphoi, plural, who have lived 65 years in the Lord, he's making his case before the recipient, and I also, Polycrates, the least of you all, pantonymon, plural, do according to the tradition of my relatives. And the final one, the most significant one, I could mention the bishops who were present, whom I summoned at your desire, humis exiosate, literally, whom to summon you deemed worthy, or you wished, or you expected that I summon, plural, whose names, should I write them, would constitute a great multitude. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. So, by contrast, however, Irenaeus' letter partially preserved by Eusebius, does address Victor in the singular. Among these, quote, among these were the presbyters before Soter, who presided over the church which you now rule. Su nun athege. Singular, which you now rule. We mean Anacetus and Pius and Hyginus and Telesphorus and Xistus. Now, something I want to point out here as well, very, very, very interesting. The presbyters before Soter, and he gives them largely in order. So Anacetus, Pius, Hyginus, Telesphorus or Telephorus, and this is in the same order as this, but he also includes a certain Xistus. Now, I didn't intend on this. I only just noticed this recently. I didn't put it in the slides, but I only just noticed it recently. Go back to his succession list. Notice, who does he name in the succession list? He names Sixtus and Hyginus and Pius. So either this... So let's go with the same order, rather. Anacetus, yep. Pius, yep. Hyginus, yep. And Telephorus, yep. Sixtus. Very interesting. Very interesting. Very, 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 very interesting indeed. Either Xistus in the letter of Irenaeus to Victor is another name for Sixtus. Maybe. Or he's naming straight up a different presbyter alongside him. And yes, I know I mentioned that, Joshua. Sixtus and Xistus, same person. Is it? Worth exploring. I haven't explored it myself, admittedly, but I know the Greek and the Latin of these names. Not the same, to put it lightly. But yeah, it's possible. But maybe he's mentioning another presbyter from the same time as Sixtus. Who knows? Speculation, I'll admit, but it's just curious. Anyway, this is the main thing anyway. Point being, Irenaeus on one hand, all popes named Sixtus are also called Xistus. Haven't researched it. There you go. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. Or maybe they did that as an after the fact thing, seeing that those two people. Who knows? Speculation. Anyway, so the important thing here is that Polybius on one hand is addressing a plural recipient. On the other hand, Irenaeus is addressing a singular recipient. Again, just in the fragments we have preserved, we don't have the full letters, so keep that in mind. But this is what we have preserved. And so Eusebius's comments place Victor as the sole instigator at Rome, but Polycrates' letter, which also dismisses threats from Rome, addresses the opposing party in the plural. So Victor may have had a particularly prominent role in the controversy. It's necessary to respect Eusebius's special access to the sources here. Again, cannot dismiss him without cause. Though it's clear from Polycrates' letter that Victor was not acting alone. This may well have been a collective action, probably perhaps headed by Victor, but nonetheless the collective will of Rome to do what they did in the controversy. And so if that is the case, and I think Polycrates' letter does kind of make that clear, that we have yet another instance of the collective Roman presbyters exercising diplomatic power, diplomatic authority, if you will, into the late 2nd century, but perhaps likely with a chief among them. And once again, I have to mention, this would eventually become the chief role of the sole bishop of monarchic episcopacy. Thomas Watson, don't have time to watch now, but I'll be sure to watch this later. God bless, brother. God bless you too, mate. Thank you very much. And to all the 25, at least, people still watching right now, thank you so much for coming along. We're approaching the big spice of analyzing the sources. But yes, this is important. This does show still that we have a collective, that we still have a collective leadership in Rome, but there is one particular figure who's rising in prominence to some degree. To how much is not exactly clear. So now we've looked at all the sources, all the necessary sources from the 1st and 2nd century regarding the Roman leadership, and now we're going to evaluate them in light of all the hypotheses. So to start with, this is the question we're asking. Is the data from this source explainable by this hypothesis? That's the question we're asking. And so now we're going to go through each source one by one and assess their compatibility with the hypotheses. Now, remember specifically for the archiepiscopacy versus the monepiscopacy, archiepiscopacy is where authority over the church is fundamentally vested in the collective leadership, but there may be a prominent figure among them of some kind, versus a monepiscopacy where the power of the church is solely vested in the authority of the church is solely vested in the bishop, and then spread out among the fundamentally different lower orders, the presbyters, priests, whatever you want to call them. And so, very important difference to keep out there. I have heard this one. I have heard this one a lot. Go for Jesus taught that this wasn't about churches in Asia Minor, but Asian Minor churches in Rome. And if that was the case, that would be very big in demonstrating plural leadership in Rome. I'm just personally not convinced of that yet because it does appear very clear that Polycarp is summoning bishops in Asia Minor for their opinion. Although, of course, I guess someone could maybe say that they are, excuse me, that they're just getting their friends at home to affirm what they're saying. So that's possible, but like it seems too big of something for Eusebius just to not get from the letters, and it does seem clear that Polycrates is writing from Asia Minor. The only thing this really hinges on, really, this theory, is that they say they sent the Eucharist, Rome sent the Eucharist to Asia Minor by tradition, but the bread would get moldy over time, whatever. For one, the wine would be fine. But second, maybe I reckon, as a charitable reading, maybe they sent the wheat or the grain that's used to make the Eucharist. I think that's a possibility. Certainly an eyebrow raiser, but a possibility. But I don't buy this hypothesis myself. And I have every interest to, as a prot, because that would strongly show the plurality of leadership and even its internal division in Rome, even among a disciple of John, who would be very clearly know about the authority of the successors of Peter. But nonetheless, evidence is evidence for me. I don't really buy this one. Anyway, so is the data of this source explainable by this hypothesis? So starting with Paul's letter to the Romans, compatibility with hypotheses. Plural episcopacy fits well, given the lack of emphasis on a single leader despite likely motivation to do so, if it were the case. With an archiepiscopal model, there is some tension, given the lack of a single leader mentioned, and none of the figures mentioned appear here or anywhere else to have preeminence over others. But it could be reconciled. I say not easily here, but I reckon it's not the most difficult reconciliation, that the archbishop would still nonetheless be considered a fundamental equal, or could be considered a fundamental equal. Now, the monepiscopacy, the lack of address to a specific supreme head, supreme above all others, rubs quite strongly against rubs quite strongly against this hypothesis. Given the clear headship supremacy he would have over the church and his spiritual source of unity. So I believe we have at least a soft, if not strong, indirect contradiction, not direct contradiction. Again, remember the distinction. I'm not saying, this refutes, this therefore says there was no bishop, but I reckon it does indirectly point against the existence of such a single supreme leader who's just left unaddressed entirely in the letter. And I think the Romanists today would grant this, because they would say, as Canadian Catholic has said in the comments, that this was likely before the time Peter came and created the monepiscopacy and all that. But again, I'd still with that say two things. One, this does establish baseline data from one of our earliest sources. But two, also, I do believe this does create questions and problems given Roman ecclesiology. And this is something I will address in the third part of this series. But yeah, so that's my evaluation of this source. Second source, First Clement. Plural episcopacy fits perfectly with the fact of plural authorship of the letter. Archiepiscopacy, again, slight tension with no appearance of the chief bishop, but not a serious contradiction, I don't think. A monepiscopacy, quite problematic, given that this would be the norm, it would eventually become the norm of the single monarchical bishop to represent his churches in overseas controversies, in controversies involving other dioceses, involving his and another, and all that stuff. And so the fact that the author is not only quite clearly multiple leaders, again, from the evidence of the letter itself and its earliest attestations, Dionysius not as clearly, but Irenaeus certainly so. So that, and again, I have to emphasize this time and time again, simply saying, this technically could be construed to mean this. If you do that, that's your prerogative. But now you have to admit that you are importing much later categories into the evidence here. This is why I'm doing something very specific. I'm working diachronically, working from the sources, the original earliest apostolic sources, to establish our categories. And then on the basis of those categories, and of course, likewise with the witnesses to the nature of the Church of Rome, work diachronically to see what shape does this take, what picture does this paint for us. If you want to say, this could nonetheless be plural leadership, you're going against the grain of the evidence. I'm just going to give away my cards right now. You're going against the grain of the evidence, because as we quite clearly see here, two-tier church structure is the norm. There's clearly multiple bishops in most areas, really, and even in Rome, if we are to assume that these are the presbyters who are authoring this letter, which I believe would be most obvious. And so the lack of any appearance by the alleged sole bishop of Rome, is high, not to mention a pope, no doubt. He is highly problematic, is very, very questionable. Why on earth does this happen? Why does it just so happen that this earliest ecclesial letter from one church to another just so happens to address itself, author, in the plural, whereas it would eventually become the norm that a monepiscopal bishop, this is his role, and the singular author would mention himself, even if he does use we say this, we believe this, and yet nonetheless it's clear that this bishop himself sent that letter. And so I believe this First Clement does, given the circumstantial kind of data that it gives, and the categories it works with and the categories it assumes from earlier sources, it does pose a problem for the monepiscopal hypothesis. I believe there is somewhat of an indirect contradiction here at minimum. Thank you again. You are pouring in money into anti-Catholic polemics. Thank you. You should go one by one like this through every NT book to see how many of them teach the doctrine of the Trinity. Not the same thing. I can explain why later. Yeah. Anyway, and it'll have to work diachronically, which is very problematic with regards to the New Testament, many New Testament books, because there are hot debates on that. Anyway. Now, Shepherd of Hermas. Compatibility of the Shepherd of Hermas with these hypotheses. Plural episcopacy fits perfectly fine. Numerous presbyters and with no distinct member mentioned. Archepiscopacy, again, as per Paul's letter, and I will emphasize as well that the lack of naming of the specific leader, of the specific bishop, is a significant silence, because that would end up becoming the norm eventually in interactions between cities and all that, when the sole bishop was the head. Anyway, archepiscopacy, again, as per Paul's letter in First Clement, there's some tension, but it's not irreconcilable. Monepiscopacy, again, as per Paul's letter in First Clement, problematic given the lack of special mention or address to the true ruling bishop. Again, monepiscopacy, authority flows down from the bishop down. And so the lack of such a category is quite significant. Additionally, and so Shepherd of Hermas is almost worse for monepiscopal case in some way. Almost worse for it, in that it explicitly says, very strong language of the presbyters presiding, proistemi, and leading, proegeomai, over the church at Rome, and even sit in the first seats. Now, consider this. This itself becomes evidence of how one of the key language categories of monepiscopacy is the idea of the seat. This bishop sits in the seat of Rome. This bishop sits in the seat of Constantinople and all that stuff. What we show here is that if monepiscopacy were true for Rome at this time, at minimum, the use of saying that these elders collectively sit in the first seats of the city, of the church, at best is highly, highly, highly improper language, if not flatly false, because it's the bishop alone who sits in the seat of the church. That is key. That is why we have, for example, the idea of the cathedral. It is the seat of the bishop, of the sole single bishop. And so at what the Shepherd of Hermas in addition shows is that a key category of monepiscopacy is violated, and that it's being applied plurally to multiple leaders. That's huge. That's very significant in my opinion. So again, language of seats eventually becomes standard for monarchic bishop, and so this is a problematic reality. Very problematic. Hang on. Semper reformandor. Oh no, Senor reformador. Canadian Catholic is like the German princes supporting financially the Prots. That's so true. Canadian Catholic, seriously, you don't have to super chat. I mean, hey, the messages aren't going super hard. You don't have to send me money, bro, for me to see a message, man. But I seriously appreciate it. Although I think you did mention it. You give small super chats so that I will guarantee to address what you say. Oh boy. Anyway, moving forward, Muratorian fragment. With respect to the okay, I won't send super chats anymore if you don't want to. Oh, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that, buddy. Don't get me wrong. If you give me money, I will take it. That's just me. That's just me being honest. That's not me being a grifter. It's just that, look, if you're just going to give me money, I will highly appreciate it. And I will thus recompense you in the way I promised. I will read your super chat. I'll give serious effort to it. Although, of course, with the amount you give, that's not as feasible for each and every single one. So I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you don't have to. I'm not saying I don't want it. I'm just saying you don't have to. That's all I'm saying. But I do highly appreciate it nonetheless. Thank you so much. Anyway, with the Muratorian fragment, with the plural episcopacy, we have a possible tension if Pius is being specially singled out, although it may likely just be mentioning him for being the brother of Hermas, not necessarily the sole or single highest overseer. So to be slightly more critical, I will say maybe a slight tension with the Muratorian fragment. Especially if we combine that. I'm just looking at these sources one by one as they are, but with prior context informing him as well. That's actually a key way I'm interpreting individual sources one at a time. So that's a key assumption. If someone wants to attack me on that, go ahead. Good luck. But otherwise, if we take like the context of later lists, bishop lists of Irenaeus and Hegesippus, in saying that Pius was on this special line and all that, and if we assume their testimony is reliable, that they were in some way prominent, then that would gel strongly against the plural episcopacy. But there's too many uncertainties, and so the Muratorian fragment on its own does not strongly contradict the plural episcopacy, but it does ask questions. Otherwise, with both the archiepiscopacy and the monepiscopacy, Muratorian fragment fits fine. But again, I'd refer back to the prior context of the Shepherd of Hermas, ironically, as mentioning that there were numerous seat holders. And so, yeah, it is possible all three hypotheses are possible here, but archiepiscopacy and monepiscopacy in particular are more possible. Number 5, Hegesippus. Plural episcopacy. Once again, somewhat of a tension, maybe a little bit more than a slight tension in singling out one line of presbyters. It's possible that he's just picking one line of succession of teaching as the example of it, but also very possible that they were prominent in some manner, and Irenaeus' testimony would seem to suggest that, assuming he's not being anachronistic, which is not beyond Irenaeus. So, some questions for plural episcopacy, but otherwise for the archiepiscopacy and the monepiscopacy, Hegesippus fits fine on his own. Now, the Irenaeus, very interesting case. With the plural episcopacy, Irenaeus, distinction of bishops and presbyters, gone. See you later. Have a good day. Very clear that they're distinct, and even if the nature of the singular bishop is unclear, it is clear that nonetheless there is a distinct bishop. And so, yeah, plural episcopacy, bye-bye with Irenaeus. You are not there. That is a direct contradiction. Now, the archiepiscopacy, Irenaeus fits quite comfortably with the data, given the simultaneous distinction and conflation of the bishop with the presbyters. So at some points, he says, there's the bishops and the presbyters, but then in reference to the bishops, he calls them the presbyters and the presbyters generally. And so there's a clear distinction, but at the same time, the bishop, they're fundamentally the same to a large capacity. And again, just the nature of the role of the bishop as opposed to the presbyters, it's just not clear in Irenaeus at all. And so, yeah, it fits well with the archiepiscopacy. Now, with the monepiscopacy, we have something very interesting, very, very, very interesting. If Irenaeus' succession equals apostolic succession proper, so as Rome and the East attest to it, where it's not simply the passing down the same teaching, but also the line of the sacramental order, sacramental validity, which is explicitly only through the one bishop. And if the presbyters in Irenaeus, I should have added that, but if the presbyters in Irenaeus generally carry down this succession, and it makes sense because Irenaeus is talking about succession of teaching, and the presbyters generally, they carry that succession of teaching, so on and so forth, so not just the bishop. And if that's the case, and if apostolic succession here, Irenaeus does include the sacramental line, then we have a flat contradiction of Roman theology, which says that only the bishops pass down apostolic succession. Yes, priests and deacons in some subordinate sense, they're ordained by apostolic succession, but otherwise bishops alone carry the apostolic succession and pass that down along. And so I'm not going to belabor this, but that will have to be for the third stream. And so, so it depends. If that's how they interpret apostolic succession, then you have a flat contradiction. Otherwise, if you go with what Irenaeus actually says and defines it as the passing down of the teachings, perhaps through a certain line of people, perhaps, but otherwise primarily define the nature of the succession as the not even the succession itself when you think about it, but just that that it preserves right teaching. If it's just that, then otherwise the data from Irenaeus has only an indirect contradiction because of how heavily he conflates the bishops and the presbyters, even though they are distinct. Yeah. Okay. Bishops in the Roman Catholic Church, those with the fullness of holy orders, Irenaeus presbyters could be model or something equivalent to bishops that don't have appointments. Here it is again. As I said at the beginning, suppositions. This could be the case. This could be that. But from the contextual data behind Irenaeus, we don't have those categories. That's it. You have to import extra assumptions into this. Just by going with the categories, what we have, the bishop is fundamentally a presbyter, but with something different about him. Exactly what? Uncertain. But again, this is what I warned about at the beginning. Could be that, but yeah. Anyway, so that's the case with Irenaeus. He nonetheless is the closest strong testimony to distinct bishoprics with regard to Rome. But even then, the categories don't exactly work. And again, as well, Irenaeus' data is too meager. Now the Quarter Testament controversy. Very interesting. Plural episcopacy, the prominent role of Victor in the comments of Eusebius and the statement of Irenaeus strongly suggests against a flat plural episcopacy. If it's uncertain, your first argument doesn't succeed against the monepiscopacy. What do you mean the first argument? Are you talking about the first sources or what? I don't really get what you're saying. Anyway, plural episcopacy, prominent role of Victor in the comments of Eusebius and the statement of Irenaeus strongly suggest against a flat plural episcopacy, very strongly against it. And then with the archepiscopacy, the cooperation of Victor and other leaders in asserting their will beyond Rome fits very well with an archiepiscopal model. Because again, archepiscopacy is being defined, that leadership, that authority, supremacy, fundamentally among the college, but there is a prominent member of some degree. Now, with the monepiscopacy, again, plural leadership making requests and threats to Polycrates in Asia Minor, is very questionable if there is only one supreme bishop through whom authority is derived, particularly in foreign interactions, which, again, becomes chiefly the role of the bishop later on. Not the most serious indirect contradiction, nonetheless, but a significant one, nonetheless, one that deserves to be... one that deserves to be, stated. So I say, and when I said uncertain, Canadian Catholic or Josh, with regards to the nature of the distinction of the bishop in Irenaeus, I'm not saying, strictly speaking, the nature of the bishop is unclear, but rather as he relates to the presbyters, as he's distinct from them. Because from the earliest sources, it's clear that they're one and the same, but eventually there is a little bit of a divergence, and that's most clear in Irenaeus. But exactly the nature of that divergence is unclear. But I still say, nonetheless, given what Irenaeus says about presbyters generally, it calls into question the nature of monepiscopacy. That's all I'm saying. Although I should have added as well the fact that he doesn't refer to sacramental validity as an argument against the Gnostics for saying that they're false churches. They don't have any sacramental validity, just like with Clement. I think that would be another argument against monepiscopacy, but that's for the third stream. So this is the total tally of evidence. As I said at the beginning, look at everything together, not just piecemeal, but everything together. What do we have? So if you look at the legend on the right, we have a green Y that equals, so the question, the data from this source is explainable by this model of hierarchy. A green Y equals yes. A green Y with an asterisk means yes, but with some tension. A red N with a till means somewhat likely not, a soft indirect contradiction, so not impossible to overcome, but questionable. An N with an asterisk means probably not, so a strong indirect contradiction. And again, I'm perfectly admit this requires some level of qualitative subjective judgment. That's absolutely unavoidable in history, so that's why I nonetheless make those distinctions. And then a red N means definitely not a direct contradiction. As in a direct contradiction, the source definitely cannot explain the model definitely cannot explain the source. And so if we look at the tally, we see a very clear picture here. Archepiscopacy is the only model that consistently lasts throughout from the beginning all the way to the end. Whereas the Presbyterian governance model does, as in a flat hierarchy, a flat presbyteral government, does work for a time, but then eventually falters with Irenaeus and with the Quartodeciman controversy. Whereas a monarchical episcopate has questions all throughout, except for the Muratorian fragment. That's because it's very brief in what it says. But otherwise, it goes from anywhere from a soft indirect contradiction to a direct contradiction in Irenaeus, depending on how you interpret his data. But otherwise, there's a ubiquitous consistency of indirect contradictions against the monepiscopacy in these sources that we have gone through. And I'll admit that more can be done with regards to Irenaeus. So that's why I have the or, so either a soft contradiction all the way to a flat out contradiction. But I'll admit as well, more study can still be done. And there may be the remote possibility that he could be reconciled with a monepiscopacy. I'll grant that possibility. So more can still be done, but I only had so much time to study. And Irenaeus can only be so clear, or unclear, rather. There's only so much we have to work with him. And so any more that we say about him does require speculation. And so this is the bird's eye view of the data. A lot of green on the middle and the right, a lot of red on the left being the monarchical episcopate. And again, this is relying on my core assumptions that one, we rely on the categories that are established by the sources themselves, particularly the original sources that form the foundation of what is to come. And we read them all together in as much harmony as we can. And that we do not apply later or foreign categories that we do not see into these texts in order to merely reconcile. I'm not dissing the conception of harmonization in general. Okay, I'm not dissing that entirely. I'm just saying that for this proper historical study, where we're not as in harmonization by means of assuming things which admittedly are not there but are otherwise technically possible. We're not doing that here. We're just looking at the evidence, at the historical evidence itself, going through with it according to the categories established by the sources themselves and interpreting them accordingly. And so from what we see there, when we actually take the sources on their own terms with charitable interpretation and reasonable speculation on occasion, but even ignoring that reasonable speculation, we get clear that the very developed categories and offices of the monepiscopacy are simply not there and struggle to make sense of the data that we do have, especially once we compare it with the data from those later periods where we can clearly see that there is one guy at the top here. One guy is calling the primary shots here. And again, I'll point to the examples again of letters by individual bishops, even on behalf of multiple churches. We know that they're by a single bishop. And that's just one of the many examples. And so this is the big picture of the data right here. And I summarize it as well in a few key claims. So the big picture. First, the Church of Rome was a confederation of numerous local churches. And this can be seen in the letter to the Romans and in the archaeological record. Number two, there was a council of overseers / bishops who / presbyters who presided over the churches of Rome. This can be seen in 1 Clement, Shepherd of Hermes, Dionysius of Corinth indirectly, and Polycrates indirectly. 2a, these overseers were said to sit in the first seats or the seat of the church, and admittedly specifically from Hermes, but nonetheless that is an attestation. So from Hermes's third vision, and to Pius specifically in the Muratorian fragment. 2b, they collectively addressed controversies, external controversies, as a collective. So First Clement, for example, as attested by Irenaeus and possibly as well Dionysius, and Polycrates as well, explicitly talking to plural recipients, presumably Roman leadership. Now, eventually, number 3, a certain line of overseers are selected as authenticating testimony of Orthodox Christian beliefs against heretical groups, perhaps the most prominent or well-known overseers. So this can be seen in the memoirs of Hegesippus and Irenaeus' Against Heresies and his letter to Victor, because he mentions a certain section of the succession. Number 4, we have a chosen line eventually considered. And by the way, people, this is a good time to set up a Q&A. We are about to happen with that. Number 4, a chosen line is eventually considered distinct overseers apart from other presbyters. And we see this in Irenaeus' Against Heresies. But as well with this, the distinct overseers are still considered presbyters themselves, 4a. And I will note as well, I think I forgot to mention this, but the distinction of presbyter and bishop does end up showing that does end up showing when and how presbyter eventually becomes a proper ecclesial title and not just a mere descriptor of overseers. And so I just note that. And then number 5, other presbyters also take part in succession, which is identified with the passing down of truth. We see this in Irenaeus' Against Heresy. Now, I will, admittedly, because thoughts are constantly evolving on this, I will admit to putting a question mark in number 5 with regards to Irenaeus, because either Irenaeus does say that presbyters generally do engage in the succession, the teaching succession of the apostles, or he's using presbyters, what's the term? Not a synecdoche. I don't think it's a synecdoche, but he's using presbyters in specific reference to the presbyters who are bishops. So not all presbyters, but specifically the bishop type presbyters. And that could be a way to read when he says those presbyters who have the succession from the apostles, and then says those presbyters who, together with the succession of the episcopate. So it would be clearer that they're distinct presbyters if it said together with the succession of the bishop, but instead he does actually say the succession of the episcopate. So that could be a way to explain that. And so that's possible. And so conclusion number 5, put a question mark in that. Do put a question mark in that, because my thoughts are constantly evolving on that. It's possible for it to be either way. So yeah, but that's just with Irenaeus' Against Heresies anyway. So there is that. And so my general conclusions overall, looking at the big picture, both individual evidence diachronically, and then looking at everything together. My first conclusion, the early Roman Church of the 1st and 2nd centuries best fits a plural and archiepiscopal model, perhaps plural at the beginning, but then eventually, but very at bare minimum, very soon archiepiscopal. And I go as far as to personally speculate that maybe, and yes, thank you very much, Matt Bell. Do bring your questions, people. Super chats and subscribe star questions get priority. And if you're a subscribe star supporter, you can send your questions in the supporter questions channel on the Discord so I can see it clearly apart from others. But otherwise, it doesn't look like a ton of people are commenting anyway. So you could give them here if you want, and I'll know if you're a supporter or not. But yeah. So I go as further as to personally speculate that there likely would have been an archiepiscopate, an arch overseer at the very beginning, at bare minimum in an informal sense, just by the nature of how human organizations work. Hierarchy, a pyramidic hierarchy, is inevitable. And we see this with the development of the church itself, the Church Universal, and individual churches throughout history. They all go monarchic eventually. So I think it's very reasonable to speculate that it was archiepiscopal at the very start, although that would assume that all the churches at Rome were immediately confederated, which, But either way, plural and archiepiscopacy. Archiepiscopacy works throughout all the data, but plural episcopacy does also work for the earliest data. Nonetheless, on point number 2, so my second conclusion, the evidence does not specially point to a monarchic episcopal structure or contradicts it in certain ways, principally in the lack of clear holy order distinction between a head bishop and other presbyters. And by holy order distinction, I mean that the bishop really is other from the presbyters, from the priesthood. And I know Romanists may contest it, but like, the bishop and the priest, they have this shared overlap and blah, blah, blah. But I'm going to address that more in the third stream, but I do genuinely believe that's different, because bishop and presbyter in the Roman theology are distinct holy orders, sharply distinct holy orders. That's a key thing. And so I believe that even up to Ignatius, the clear separation, probably the better word, of the bishops from the presbyters is significant potentially. And yeah, points. So that is point more clearly in the earliest source. The earliest sources are much more explicit about bishops, presbyters being the same group. But even up to Irenaeus, they're still questionable that they're even distinguished. They're separated, rather. Better to say separated. And so anyway, so in the lack of clear holy order distinction between a head bishop and other presbyter bishops, and in the constant unity of authority and preeminence among the collective elders in the sources, and in the clear conflation of bishops/presbyters in the earliest sources. And again, so Romanists will very often do this, take one little point and just refute that on its own and don't take it all together. This is the thing. I totally grant that a Romanist could, with some reasoning, say that, no, this individual point doesn't refute us because we could, because granting these assumptions, this could be the case and it fits their hypothesis. Not the point. We're taking everything together, big picture, look at it all as a whole. Go back. Let me go back quickly. Go back to these big picture comments with the sources that they point to and look back at this table tally and the reasoning I use to justify each and every one of these points. When you look at everything from a bird's eye, when we see time and time again references to plural leadership in Rome, that is significant testimony. That tells us something very different to what Vatican I asserts. Okay? Very, very different. Even if you could technically say there's nothing incompatible with multiple bishops, because then there could be one of them who's supreme, you are importing a later category that is not granted. That is eisegetical by definition. You have to support you end up having to support your beliefs and on the grounds of foreign categories. And where that matters is not to say, therefore you're wrong, straight up. I'm more nuanced than that. It's simply to say that, look, from an apologetic standpoint, you're worse off. You end up being worse off because us Protestants are more than justified to believe. We are more justified to believe that there wasn't even a single bishop in Rome at the beginning than you are in believing that there was a single bishop in Rome from the beginning. That's what I'm trying to conclude here. Don't misconstrue my conclusions, okay? In case anyone's thinking otherwise. But yeah, so the categories and the attestations that are given, lack of clear holy order separation, the consistent unity of the authority and preeminence among the collective elders in the sources, and again, especially in addressing external controversies, that's a really big one, and in the clear conflation of bishops/presbyters in the earliest sources, not to mention not the most absolute contradictions, I make that clear, with the potential exception of Irenaeus, but these are strong signs that, taken together, point against a monarchic environment. And so, and in addition to that, core categories that undergird monarchic episcopacy are absent from the sources or misused if the monarchic episcopate was in place. So, for example, 3-tier holy orders, absolutely necessary for the monarchic episcopacy. And the earliest sources very explicitly speak against that. At least the tier hierarchy as Rome understands it, because I know Hermas has one, but it's clear that it's quite clear that the highest tier is occupied by multiple elders. Also, the concept of the bishop in general, there is very explicit in the sources that there very often is, if not in the norm. I haven't done anything comprehensive, but otherwise very normal for there to be numerous bishops over one city. It's very easy, very clear for that. And then likewise, we see that given that it's conflated very often in those earliest sources with in First Clement, particularly, for example, conflated with the presbyters. And given that there are numerous presbyters making this address to Corinth, it's abundantly clear that the supreme authority is shared. It's not sourced from one individual. It becomes very clear. You could, in the raw technical sense, inject those later categories into Clement and not have a technical contradiction between the specific words, but that's not legitimate. That you now have to admit that you are divorcing it from its context and employing other categories that are not established. And then, of course, the whole comment about the plural leaders at Rome in the Shepherd of Hermas occupying the first seats collectively. At best, that's an abuse of monarchic language, if that was in place then. Yeah. And so, final conclusion, one is on firmer ground in affirming an archiepiscopal model, whilst many external assumptions and foreign categories are required to attempt a reconciliation of the evidence with a monarchic episcopacy. That's my core thing. So again, I don't assert that, hey, we have this direct statement that says there was multiple bishops of equal power in Rome, therefore it's wrong. My argument is from the basic assumption that we should allow historical sources to define their own categories and not to unduly import other categories into it unless the sources and the context themselves permit it or require it. And just by going that and then reading the sources diachronically, allowing them to establish their own categories and thus establishing the nature of the development. So from the flatter hierarchy up to the distinction of Bishop, Presbyter, and Irenaeus, and allowing them to do that allows us to paint the authentic picture of what is most likely happening here. Even in, because I will say also on this issue, we have much fewer sources than many other issues. I think the next stream is going to be even more spicy because I believe we have much more evidence and much clearer evidence on the whole issue of the Petrine office. And, but yeah, either way, I think nonetheless, with the evidence of what we do have, it does paint a picture that tells us something contrary to what Vatican I says. Again, not claiming absolute contradiction, but a contradiction in spirit, if you will, an indirect contradiction by what is described to us using categories that will eventually be shifted to just one bishop, for example. So that's what I'm claiming here. That's what I'm claiming here. The Protestant is there is no apologetic power on this topic for the Romanists. There is none. Simple, very very clearly, because the evidence, as I've shown here, even if I was to make my comments and conclusions a bit more milder, the evidence would still prefer the belief that multiple bishops shared power over the Church of Rome early on. And so, and even if you could try to technically make this compatible with monoepiscopacy, a Protestant would nonetheless be on very firm ground, remaining where he is and not accepting that there was a Bishop of Rome with supremacy over the whole church. And thus, the apologetic value is just lost. It's just very much lost. The only thing that could really overcome it is something very clear from Christ or the apostles themselves making this the case. But again, as I'll demonstrate in the next stream, that isn't the case, and thus gels very well with this evidence. So, yeah, there's not much else to say apart from that. Those are my overall conclusions in this. We've gone for almost 3 hours and a half. All right, this is amazing. I'm priding myself on being a bit more terse in this stream because, again, we had a lot of material to cover. And I wasn't distracted by the comments anywhere near as much. But nonetheless, people said stuff, and so, yeah. Anyway. So, thank you all so much. Give me just like 1 minute because I need water so badly. Talk amongst yourselves. I need water. I'll just be a few seconds. We are back. Woo! Occasional videos, make sure to pee. Actually, I just did as well. not here, not in the toilet. Only took me a few seconds. Oh man, this is big. This is really, really big. I'm hoping this presentation was informative, that I lived up to saying that this was definitive, as definitive as it can be. And I think I said this earlier. When I said definitive, I'm not saying I never meant that I would conclude there was definitely a monopiscopacy, or there was definitely an archiepiscopacy, or definitely this, definitely that. I'm just saying a definitive look at the evidence in the sense of the overall picture, with detail. And I'll admit I could do more in Irenaeus, but it's just that he says so little. But nonetheless, I believe what I have done is definitive in establishing what we see in the sources themselves, the primary sources themselves, and just drawing all the pieces together, bringing about what is said in them, what the picture that they paint collectively. And I believe in that really key sense, this has been definitive and hopefully groundbreaking. I really do hope that this presentation starts up some new questions and conversations, and that in this dialogue, God willing, even causes Romanists to reconsider where they keep their faith in. I'll be totally open and upfront about that. This isn't just for purely intellectual interest. This is for a greater purpose overall, and not that I started with the conclusion, I ended there, but I genuinely believe in this conclusion after study, and I want to make it clear. So yeah, if you guys like this, please make that shout that out in the comments, if you will, because I really do hope that this was that this was as major and groundbreaking and informative as I hyped it up to be. We've gone for like 3.5 hours, so I really hope so. I really do. Anyway, we got questions time now. I am gonna scroll all the way to the top because I think there were questions at the very start of this. Scroll all the way to the top, but of course I'm going to start with supporter questions. So that's right, not patrons technically anymore, but not patrons, but subscribe star people. We have our first one from my man E Cinque, and I'm still trying to figure out a way again to show questions on the screen from the Discord from people on the server. Anyway, oh boy, the debate rooms are full. Oh, awesome. Anyway, first question from one of my diakonoi, E Cinque. He asked, this is a supporter question. Have you had much of a chance to look at the papal supremacy series from Apologia Anglicana? If so, what are your thoughts on it? I have not yet, but I've wanted to. I've only just found it recently because I rewatched his interview with Father James on his channel, Barely Protestant. So yeah, pretty much just that. I haven't seen it yet, but I do intend to watch it. It does look pretty darn good, and yeah, I hope it's informative. So that's pretty much that. Not much else to say about that. I think I have. Is there another question towards the beginning? So I'll just kind of scroll down. Okay, here we go. Senor Reformador. If we use the concept of ordination as understood today when reading 1st or 2nd century literature, are we being anachronistic? Was the diaconate just a lay ministry at the beginning? Well, yeah, I think so. I think the concept of ordination is a bit simpler in these earlier sources. I think we do have clear showing, for example, that it was fundamentally something of the people to bring up successors. And of course, some people have said, "Oh, well, yeah, we agree. There's multiple places in Orthodoxy and even in Rome where they vote on their leader, but then the leader is ordained specifically by bishops and all that." But again, I find it questionable that this thing is mentioned, that the people consent to who becomes the leader. Someone appoints it, and yet there's no mention of like the special ordination and all that. It's a bit more developed, so that's what I say. Well, I do believe ordination in a basic sense is apostolic, 100%. Just the idea of who can do it and the conditions as definitely developed. So that's what I'd say about that. Let's keep going. Ooh, I think all the questions end up being focused towards the bottom here, but I'm just scrolling through still. you have time, if you haven't already, to sign up to Subscribestar and then subscribe to the page, and thus get your questions with the priority. I hope you're not going to impress me that the philosophy program, blah, 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 blah. Just trying to make sure I don't miss anything, because I don't want to be like Anthony Rogers who misses on people's super chats. Like, come on, bro. Man. Okay. This may be one. Would it be true? Would it be true to say that no bishop in the first century claimed to be the chief shepherd of the church? If you mean of the church universal, I'd say definitely. But that's for the next stream. But if you meant of the chief shepherd of the local church, well, I guess I'd say the same. Yeah, we don't see that claim anywhere in the first century, but we don't have a lot in the first century. We've got to qualify that. Let's see. Liam, even Paul admits plural is not fatal because it could be royal way, etc. It's just Paul thinks the plural's use is more likely and more evidence. Evidence based. Well, yeah, that's right. That's why I don't say merely we, but we plus the Church at Rome is the author, plus the Church at Corinth is clearly multiple individuals, plus Irenaeus distinguishes between Clement and the Church at Corinth of Rome, plus Dionysius appears to use Clement as an instrument of the letter and not the author per se. So all that combined, I think, gives a really clear picture that First Clement is, in fact, First Rome. So yeah. Reformed Presbyter, good to see you, buddy. The view that Rome has a special place of authority to correct other churches assumes that one must have authority over one another in order to correct error, but the view is just bad assumption. I think you might want to say that the Bishop of Rome, so the view of the Bishop of Rome, that the Bishop of Rome has a special place of authority to correct other churches, assumes that one must have authority over... Oh, so no, I get what you're saying. No, I 100% agree. I think those assumptions on authority of people correcting and all that, they're too quickly chucked in there, because it's not necessarily the case. Not necessarily at all. How's the sun going? Oh, it's a little bit bright, but I'll just open up a little. Pionano declared he was the bishop over the whole church, monepiscopacy par excellence, very base indeed. Okay, I think the main bunch of questions are coming up now. Here we go. Does this language, Dr. Bob, regarding the seat of honor potentially give us insight into the architecture of early church buildings, or is it metaphorical? I mean, I think it is primarily in reference to authority, but I speculated it is possible that it gives us an insight into like the seating of the thing. It's possible, but we can't know for sure without archaeology. So, yeah. And as I mentioned here, yep, Justin does talk about deacons handing out the Eucharist. Johnny F, what's up? Disappointing that you didn't call this series The Great Debunking. That can be the informal name. No way. Totally, 100% all for that. Okay, I think I'm coming on the main questions now. Here we go. Okay, the main bulk of questions that everyone... Oh my word, that's a lot. Okay. Woo! Hey, Andy Bales, you're still here, man. No way, you're still going. I was sure I'd missed the whole thing. Well, you missed the main thing. But but no, obviously you can rewatch it. But far out, 3 hours and almost 40 minutes now. Anyway, main questions. Thank you for that notification, Matt Bell. A goy for Jesus. Would you say the main approach of Roman apologists is to isolate individual strands of evidence instead of looking at all of them together? Yeah, 100% agree with that. I think Swan Sonners, and no disrespect to him, the guy's clearly intelligent. Like his knowledge of scholarly literature is off the charts. It's actually crazy. But nonetheless, the way he did his presentation, I think it'd be good for people to compare his case for the monepiscopacy on Reason and Theology with mine here, to see how different our approaches is. Because what he does is he basically does that. He looks at the evidence one by one and then explains each individual piece of evidence on its own, largely decontextualized, and harmonizes it with a monepiscopacy, which is not what I do, and it's not a properly historical method, really, at all. And so, like, with the perfect example being the Shepherd of Hermas, he's like, oh, yeah, okay, Shepherd of Hermas does appear to mention multiple elders or bishops, but it nonetheless doesn't mean that there isn't one bishop above the rest and all that stuff, and blah, 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 and only one with the power to ordain and the others don't have. And it's like, well, okay, cool. Technically possible, granted. It's also technically possible that one bishop is considered the god emperor of mankind because nothing militates strictly against it. That's why I brought up that example at the beginning, to show just how meaningless a mere harmonization can be in the light of evidence. Well, that to just say, oh, it doesn't explicitly say it isn't there, because you can say that for any number of patently absurd things. And so it does nothing to actually help your position, except for maybe getting rid of a defeater. And so, sure, purely for just maintaining the technical possibility of your hypothesis, that can work. For actually showing it as something that's more true, does nothing. But yeah, so yeah, 100% agree with that. I do say that is their main approach. That is what they often do. Whereas what I did here is, God willing, I hope what I did here was fairly unique and groundbreaking for this discussion, where I just took everything together, allowed the sources to find their own categories, and came to a good conclusion. Thank you, Gabriel. Great presentation, man. God bless you. Bye. Senor Reformador, could we say at least that congregationalism is ruled out when studying the structure of the early church? I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Because the whole thing with synodality and all that, and federation of multiple church regions, I think that does appear later, but it does appear in the very earliest stages of the churches when they were just infant. But they largely did their own thing with apostolic oversight, granted, but nonetheless were quite independent. So I don't think that can be ruled out definitively. Again, we only have so much data that we can't say a whole ton on it. So, was there a difference between consecrating and ordaining in the early church? Some argue that the diaconate was more consecrated office than an ordained one. Well, it would depend on what period you're talking about. I haven't studied this issue, that issue particularly, let alone through the rest of the church period. So I don't know, maybe. I just don't think that with the evidence we have in the end with the New Testament, they just talk about general idea of appointment to the offices. There's no advanced categories that come about later. That's all I know. Born again question: when Irenaeus talks about the authority of the Bishop of Rome, is he using it as an authority over a general area as opposed to supremacy over all Christendom? So now here's the thing. This is mainly going to be for the next stream. But Irenaeus does not talk about the authority of the Bishop of Rome. He talks about the authority of Rome. So that's a key thing to miss. And the only kind of response, there's only been a pretty poor one, like really poor response I've seen to this, but it is clear in Irenaeus the authority is at the Church of Rome itself. And granted, on monepiscopacy, it's possible to use that as a kind of metonym, and that this is held properly by the Bishop of Rome. Yep, cool, granted. But just taking Irenaeus on its own, he says that the greater preeminence or the greater authority is with the church collectively. So it's possible it could manifest in a single bishop. It's also possible that it could manifest with the plural bishops. Yeah, anyway. So keep that in mind. So when he talks about the authority of the Church of Rome, as I argued earlier, this is an authority that is an intellectual authority, because that is the entire point of Irenaeus' argument. They have a strong pedigree and a strong attestation of apostolic tradition, and so they're looked up to as a fantastic exemplar of authentic faith by the other churches on the grounds of their preservation of tradition. Which, unless you assume the indefectibility of the See of Rome, is a contingent reality. And so, yeah, because Irenaeus never says whether this could or could not fail to be the case. I would personally assume that just given human nature, just given the reality of human nature, Irenaeus would grant the possibility that it one day falls. But as for his time, no, it's fine. Is it conspiranoic or anti-historical to say the notion of monarchical ecclesiology may came from the Roman Empire, not the Christian Church itself? I think there's warrant. I think there's warrant to that. To an extent, it would depend on how closely bishops were considered with like the state and all that, and whether they typologized each other and all that stuff. To say that as like a primary source, a primary cause, probably not. Nah, that would be a bit odd. I'd just say monarchical ecclesiology was a very natural development, very, very natural development, just from the nature of hierarchy and the Christian faith itself. But then, of course, political machinations happen, and Bob's your uncle. You get the monarchic episcopacy. There's something I would like to study further. Why did the separation between the bishop and presbyter happen? Damn, we have a good number of questions. I like this. Any supporter questions, or apart from each inquiries? No, no other questions. That's all good. No. Okay. Go for Jesus. Do papal claims which require succession require Peter to be the founder of the Church of Rome, like he was mistakenly believed in the early church? I personally believe so. Yes. Because I genuinely believe, because they dismissed this, like, okay, yeah, Irenaeus was wrong. There was a Church of Rome before Peter, but then Peter came. And I think, given the nature of proper ecclesial order in Roman theology and Orthodox theology and all that stuff, this is something I'm going to leave mainly to the third stream, and this is assume my thoughts don't evolve in it, because I'm still going to be studying this. But the idea that there are legitimate churches, legitimate churches that Paul is commending in Rome. And so, given Roman theology, they must have had valid priests and bishops. They must have at the outset of some capacity, to be valid churches with valid apostolic succession, etc., etc. And but then for Peter and Paul, rather, to come along and establish a new successional line on top of what already must have existed, in my opinion, unless they want to posit that Rome was deprived of bishops for many years, which, again, is just bizarre given what the apostles are trying to do with the bishopric. The whole point of the bishopric is to be there. And so for the apostles to fail to get bishops at the outset in some of the biggest Christian communities, like, bro, what? But yeah, anyway, so then for Peter and Peter and Paul, don't forget, that's the earliest sources say Peter and Paul, but let's just say Peter on his own, for example, to come along and establish a new episcopal line over the top of that. I mean, it's not technically impossible, I guess. Well, but maybe on Roman ecclesiology that could create some problems at a bare minimum. Like, what happened to the earlier line? Why would Peter even establish a new episcopal line? Why on earth would he have to do that at all if the Roman Church already existed? Which may well become further argument against the monepiscopacy itself, now that I think about it. Just the circumstances of it are really bizarre. And perhaps also against interpretations of Irenaeus' data, or perhaps if Irenaeus himself interprets it as there always being one bishop. Because that's just a really bizarre scenario when you think about it. But so yeah, I do think right now, in my less learned opinion, that Peter not founding the Church of Rome and not truly speaking being the first bishop is a problem. But that's going to have to wait to the third stream and how my research lays out. Let's see. Yep, no, just regular questions so far. In Presbyterian churches, we essentially have an archiepiscopacy with our session and the pastor at the head. There you go. Thank you, Matt, for sharing the subscribe star. Support me, ladies and gentlemen. Dave, have you ever read the prelatical doctrine of apostolical succession examined by Thomas Smith? I haven't, no. Sounds very fancy. What's it about? I'm curious. Love the Beast Rogers. Yeah, oath. I'm heading with Bird Great String. God bless. Yep. Will Def be rewatching this? Oh, you def wanna Bales. Senor Reformado. So I think we Lutherans should implement an archiepiscopal polity and apostolic succession through bishops like the Latvian or Kenyan Lutherans. Adam slaps some Newmans on it. Senor Reformador. How the distinction between primacy of honor and jurisdictional primacy could affect this discussion? Well, we just have to ask, is the distinction warranted? Because ironically, what's really ironic is that the Roman apologists at the same time against the Orthodox, because the Orthodox like to make this distinction with respect to early claims on the Bishop of Rome. where they'll say that, oh, look, there's this language that clearly is allotting a massive place of honor for the Bishop of Rome. And then they'll just say something like my buddy Craig will say, oh, this is Byzantine flattery, and oh, it's a primacy of honor and all that stuff, blah, blah. And the Roman apologists, with some warrant, will say, well, what does that mean, just to be in the first place of honor, but it has no material effect to it? What does that mean? And so if they wanted to argue that, then they would have to concede in this situation that there really isn't a hard distinction between primacy of honor or jurisdictional supremacy either. So supremacy either. So that's what I'd say about that. So yeah, and that's all the questions so far. I'll give it like another minute or two if anyone wants to ask anything more. And Father James Gadd mentioned me in something. Interesting. Oh no way! He mentioned someone who's. Oh no, that's in America. Never mind. Okay, any last questions from people? Doesn't strongly look like it. All right, then in that case, I think we may just about call it. We are 10 minutes away from the 4-hour mark. Oh, there was never this idea of papal infallibility in the early Roman Episcopacy. Facts, slap some Newman on it. 100%. Oh, man. Good night, fools. Done right. Ladies and gentlemen, for everyone who watched, this is a very big viewership, and thank you all to everybody who was able to stick out the whole thing. And if you didn't get to watch the whole thing, I hope you can eventually. This has gone absurdly long. But I really do pray, ladies and gentlemen, that this truly was informative, that this really did add something to the discussion, that it will make waves, and God willing, I even get some responses. I'm waiting for Romanist apologists to respond to me, like video stream format, like a response to the other poll. And I'm hoping someone tries to do that, at least with sections of this. I'm not gonna expect them to respond to everything because this has gone for a bloody long time. But even just to condense my points and respond to that'd be awesome. I just hope this does make some waves in the discussion, because I think I have contributed something unique to this discussion, even when going over the same data, and actually in a couple of points some unique data as well. So yeah, I hope this is really great. Just tuned in, missed it all. Can you repeat? Okay, back to the first slide then, I guess. So g'day, brothers and sisters. Is yeah, no. Oh, man. Okay, one more question. How would you answer the argument that the episcopacy as it is today is divinely instituted? How the organization wasn't rigid in the first 2 centuries, mostly present in Asia Minor? Well, I'd say the episcopacy was divinely instituted. But if they want to say the monarchical episcopacy was divinely instituted, I'd say that the facts flatly go against it because, well, now we're going beyond just Rome. This was just with Rome. But then if we just look at all the early primary source data collectively, demonstrably monarchical episcopacy at minimum was not common, and plural episcopacy or archiepiscopacy was very common. So I just say that that's flatly wrong. Oh man, but guys, thank you all so much. Please do spread this around to everyone you know who would be interested in this. This is a huge amount of work, very significant. Part 2 of this stream is going to be even more spicy because we have a lot more explicit, clear data to deal with. So that's going to be even more fun. And much more to the heart of the issue that I'm addressing with. Did Christ establish a unique Petrine office, and one that's passed down through successors? That's going to be the second part. It's going to be coming up later. But for the time being, I have a few other things coming up here. So on the 21st, well, my 21st, I think, is my debate with Craig Trulia on the gospel truth. We'll be debating whether church tradition is infallible. It'll be my second debate ever online. Actually, no, my third debate, and also my second with Craig Trulia. So this is gonna be very fun. It's gonna be very good, very edifying, God willing, very substantive, very meaty. And on the 25th, so just a few days after that, is my discussion with Father James and Trent Horn over Trent Horn's questions that allegedly Protestants cannot uniformly answer. So that's gonna be huge as well. But between now and then, there's a few things in the works as well. I plan on collaborating with Truth Under Godliness, my buddy Michael Potomapotos, on justification in First Clement. I'll have a big thing on that. It'll be on his channel because it'll be fit well with his series on justification. And a couple other things with my other prop boys. where we will be reacting to bad Romanist apologetics. That's gonna be something we're doing. But there was also something I forgot exactly. I think there's one other thing me and a couple of prop guys wanted to respond to specifically. I'm not sure that I'll have to ask them again. But yeah, we'll be collaborating. That's going to at least be with myself, Reformed Dweeb, Matthew Pearson, and Christian Mario at least, and Matthew Pearson, and others. And what the heck? Hang on. Oh, I forgot to put my phone on charge. I need that for church tonight. So there's that as well. And that's at least going to be 2 parts because we want to make sure we get a bunch of other people on as well who weren't able to make it straight away. So yeah, that. What else? And sometime this week, maybe tomorrow if he's cool for it, but probably sometime later on this week, I'll be collabing with Christian Wagner on exploring the concepts of the Trinity within the Apostolic Fathers. So that's going to be very, very cool as well. And apart from that, that's about it for now. I think I'll try to get a gaming stream or 2 maybe. And maybe as well, what else was I thinking of? More work on some major videos that have been like on the pause for a while, like my Beth Allison bar review. I haven't worked on that in a while and I need to get back on it. But yeah, I do intend to make a bunch of clips of this stream and upload them over time because it's a very big and meaty thing and I don't expect people to watch the whole thing all the time. But I will get some clips from key points and upload them separately over time. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. I really do hope this was edifying. Let me go to that last slide. I really do hope this is edifying and educational and really makes a splash in this topic. That's it. Yes, me and the Golf G's. We have this mad idea plan: smashing the Bayesian calculator. I'll talk more about that soon. I'll give some early announcements to supporters on that in just a second because we're planning on doing this. Is going to be a really funny collab. Jeff's idea. But yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned from this. I hope you have a lovely day or evening. God bless.